Hey friends, welcome to the channel. So here's another interesting story of Deku. What if Deku evolved to adapt Metamorphosis Quirk? I give full credits to authors in the starting of the video. If you want to see more stuff like this, then please subscribe to the channel and also do check the talented author of this captivating story. Symbiosis Origins by Alan Quicksilver. Please search it on Google. So let's begin. Chapter 1. Close Encounters. Izuku Midoriya was on the ground, lying flat. The sky was turning from a vivid blue to a dusk-colored orange-violet. His entire body ached, and even though he knew he would soon have to return home for dinner, he wasn't sure he could muster the energy to get up just yet. As he lay there, exhausted from the pounding, a figure with dark hair crouched next to him, obstructing his view. Izuku said nothing, knowing all too well what was about to happen. "Thanks for trying to protect me. But maybe we should just stay away from Bakugo from now on." Over the previous few years, the scene had been repeated several times. "And don't talk to me anymore. If Bakugo and his gang see us talking, he'll be even more upset. I don't want to get hurt again." The other youngster stood up and began hobbling home, but Izuku had borne the full of Bakugo's resentment for attempting to stand up for the other child, even in the absence of a peculiarity. As the light faded into evening, he looked up at the sky and considered his desire to be a hero once more. He was adamant about becoming just like his idol, All Might, even though he had no idea how he would succeed in the absence of the same natural talent that all of his peers possessed. Izuku had wanted to defend and make others feel safe since kindergarten, and he thought that the #1 hero was the coolest thing in the world. He wouldn't give up after 3 years of putting up with Kachan's abuse and the sympathy looks others gave him when they realized he was an oddball. He refused to allow it. Naturally, he had moments of self-doubt, but he would always return home and watch one of his idol's videos, old interviews, footage from tragedies, villain fights, anything to bolster his confidence. It would probably take him a good number of such videos to make up for today's disappointment. Izuku shifted his head to one side, not quite feeling up to testing his legs just yet. He could observe the movement of a tree close to one of the walls enclosing the area across the park's stone flooring. The rustling of the leaves could have been caused by an animal, possibly a kitten. He observed for a while until his legs stopped feeling like jelly, and he carefully stood up. Izuku shuffling to the tree to investigate the rustling continued even though he knew he should be heading home. At times, heroes had to save animals as well, so they couldn't be selective about who they helped. It took some time, but ultimately he was squinting as he stared up into the tree's branches, trying to figure out what was causing the leaves to move so strangely. Gradually, he noticed something close to the upper branches, but he was unable to identify it. In an attempt to obtain a better look and determine if he could be of any use, he shuffled about the base of the tree. He was able to make out a mass of something sleek and brownish hidden among the branches when he found himself sandwiched between the wall and the massive trunk of the tree. Whatever it was, it seemed to be shivering, and the temperature was still rather warm even though the sun was sinking. Izuku knew that shivering was only caused by anxiety, not by cold. "How are you?" he asked. Maybe if he could attract the thing's attention, he could gently entice it to come down from the tree and then determine what to do next. He cautiously reached for the bottom of his red shirt, asking, "Do you need help?" while waiting for an answer. The mass at the top of the tree appeared to practically glide down from where it was sitting all of a sudden. It moved quickly towards him, and before he knew it, it was directly overhead. Startled, he stumbled back onto his posterior, leaning against the wall and gazing upwards. Its skin glistened like some sort of slime, so at first he believed it was some sort of blob monster. However, when he looked closer, he saw that it had multiple spindly arms and legs, as well as what seemed like a bony tail, all curled up together. He also saw what appeared to be a head, though its peculiar crystalline structure made him unsure. Izuku tried not to panic and swallowed gently. He fervently prayed that he had not caught the eye of a criminal on the run from the law. He asked again, "Do you need help?" The creature's head appeared to have an eye open, as abruptly as it had moved. Izuku had never seen anything like the eye. He peered into me, finding me about the size of a baseball, and saw what appeared to be stars and galaxies he had studied in school. The item slowly uncurled from its balled-up state as he stared into that eye. Its 4 slender legs, lacking any sort of feet, made contact with the earth. Its 8 arms spread apart to show hands, composed of 3 fingers coated in suction cups. With gradual uncurling, The tail revealed that it also had a hand attached to the end of it. Although its body was slender, Izuku had never seen a bone structure like that in any of his science lectures. The monster was standing, and he saw that the brown skin on its sides and back had what appeared to be gashes and burns where the brown skin gave way to teal patches. There were jagged edges and bright yellow blood, where he had previously thought to be smooth, glossy skin. He cautiously stood, leaning against the wall for support, and cocked his head to get a clear view of the beast. He felt a weird sensation just behind his brow as he struggled to decide what to do. A slight pressure developed, and after a brief interval, he could make out a faint sound. The park was still deserted as he swiveled his head in an attempt to locate the source of the noise. Young person. Izuku leapt and started scanning the area anxiously. That's when he swore he heard a voice. His thoughts turned to running away as he murmured to himself, "What's going on?" "Kindly pay attention," the voice said. "I've come a long way, and I have serious injuries." It was a deep, rich voice that appeared to be simultaneously coming from everywhere and nowhere. Izuku turned his head back to face the being. The monster moved its head in what he could only interpret as a nod, asking, "Is that you?" He asked, "Is there anything I can do?" Not knowing if this was all true. Izuku attempted to protect his head, but it's possible that Bakugo had rendered him unconscious. He hoped that if this was a dream, it would wake him soon. "I promise you, child, that I am real and not only in your head." He nodded, acknowledging that the voice was back in his thoughts and that he was okay with it. All he could do was that. "My wounds are severe, and they will undoubtedly cause my death. Although there is nothing you can do to save me, there is something you can do to help." Izuku appeared upset. Was this creature going to perish? Izuku had never given death much attention during his early years. He was aware of mortality because it was taught at school. He'd never allowed himself to consider the idea beyond that. He was pretty sure the creature was right, even though he didn't like that there was nothing he could do to help it. Izuku couldn't quite put his words into words, but they felt real anyway. However, he would concentrate on helping if there was anything he could do to support. As All Might once said, kids could be heroes too, if they choose to provide a hand when and where they could. Izuku loved the interview because it gave him a sense of accomplishment for assisting his mother around the house. He knew it was getting dark, and he would definitely get in trouble for sticking out so late. Despite the worry he would cause his mother, Izuku looked square into the eye of the beast and nodded. He desired to assist. "I have a type of slumber where I can stay alive for extended periods of time. I can live for maybe 10 more of your earthly years, as I have done for many of them already. If I could join with another life, I could extend that for an additional 10. Your world is not prepared for a threat that it faces. Although I am aware that your leaders would not listen to me as I do, I may still supply the facts. It is not a little request that I am making. If you choose not to assist me, I would understand." Izuku gave it some thinking. It sounded as though something significant will occur in the distant future. The alien desired to aid the inhabitants of Earth, despite the unpleasant-sounding name. Once more, he fidgeted with the underside of his shirt. And while he was unsure of how the creature would emerge with him, his greatest desire was to be a hero. Heroes were always required to perform risky and challenging tasks. According to All Might, a hero must be willing to take risks and pursue his or her dreams despite fear. Izuku had always dreamed of becoming a hero, and this might be the beginning of a great journey for him. "I'll lend a hand," he declared. Izuku screwed up his face and closed his eyes after that. He remained motionless, praying that the creature's next move wouldn't injure him. "You won't get hurt by this. My strength will become yours, and I will integrate with your body. I'll make the most of my remaining time by teaching you how to utilize it so you can defend your people." Izuku felt a startling thrill when the thing stopped talking. His body felt simultaneously heated and chilled, which was really unusual. Though there was no pain, he could feel his insides twiddling and twisting. He could feel his body moving without his guidance, but he had no idea how long it would last. Izuku began to feel disoriented, and before he could process anything, he lost consciousness and his vision. He felt nothing as the world went dark. Izuku heard a frantic voice talking when he realized what was going on in the globe. He had a weird feeling in his brain and everything was fuzzy. His mind started to clarify as the moments went by, and he attempted to ascertain what was happening. The cushions on his back felt soft beneath him instead of the harsh ground. He could tell by a little squirming that he had a pillow beneath his head and a blanket loosely wrapped around him. Before long, his mind had cleared enough to distinguish the speaker and its words. Izuku realized his mother was on the phone and recognized her voice. I could tell right away what happened, the way his body was burned and bruised. She'd stopped talking as though she was waiting for a response, but there was no one else to speak in her place. Still, she responded. There was another delay while his mother waited for an answer. How many times is Katsuki going to get away with this behavior? I've tried to be patient with him, and poor Izuku keeps saying that they're friends and he doesn't want to get him in trouble, but this time it's gone too far. Izuku was still dazed, but he had no doubts about who was on the other end of the queue. His mum was having a terrible time with Bakugo's mum. He had to get up and reassure her that everything was fine. But before he could move, he heard a voice in his head. It would not be advisable to move at this time. For a brief moment, Izuku was overcome with panic, but then his memories of the day quickly returned to him. The battle and the animal he had discovered. He had nearly dismissed it as a dream. I'm afraid it will take some time for the integration to be finished. You could hurt yourself if you move your body, thus I suggest against it. Just as Izuku turned to look back at the beast, he was sidetracked by his mother's words. There was another little silence, and Izuku couldn't recall the last time he'd heard his mother so upset. I'm glad you understand, just please make sure something is done. What if he really hurts someone next time? I don't want to have to take Izuku to the hospital or worse, the mortuary. There was a beep, and the phone clanked back into its hook. Thank you, she murmured. I'd appreciate it if your boy could at least leave Izuku alone if he can't be nice. His mother gave a little puff of annoyance, and he heard footsteps approaching him. A hand brushed across his hair, and he heard his mother's worried murmurs. He heard the news broadcast start with stories about construction and train delays as she sat next to him and the television turned on. The creature's voice returned to him as the sound receded from his conscious awareness. Please allow me to introduce myself before we get too far ahead of ourselves. Mentally nodding, Izuku waited. We speak different languages, so my name might not be very clear, but you appear more comfortable with each other if you have a phone number. I've made a good substitute. You can call me Kish. Izuku mentally experimented with that. He was unlikely to come across someone with that name in Japan, but it was straightforward and simple to remember. It felt right. I'm happy you concur, Kish went on. I have a few things to clarify for you so you know exactly what's going on. I am what you would refer to as an alien or extraterrestrial. Izuku was astounded by the details. Before today, no one had been certain that aliens even existed. He had encountered a real-life alien. As it happens, my type is peaceful and doesn't intend to hurt anyone. All we want to do is share knowledge and advance comprehension of our universe. That was a really nice idea in his opinion. That was something he could support, sharing information and improving the world. He recalled hearing from one of his teachers that if humans had not evolved peculiarities, they may already be taking holidays on Mars. Izuku paused and attempted to pose a query. He directed his query towards Kish. He asked, "Where did you come from?" Right away. I am from a different galaxy, far away from the stars in the Pisces constellation. Since before the dust surrounding your star even began to solidify into the Earth, my people has been traveling the stars. Izuku wasn't really sure how long that was, but he was certain it was a greater amount than he could now fathom. Kish continued to clarify, appearing to concur with that. I got trapped in the middle of a conflict between two alien armies on my way into your galaxy. They got into a fight before I could get cover, and I got seriously hurt. Sleep was necessary for my survival. Izuku apologized for causing you pain. He was not fond of other people being harmed. Kish answered, "Thank you. I really appreciate your empathy. You have allowed me to share your body, therefore I won't pass away for a long time. I also thank you for it. All I can do is hope that the power it grants you will be sufficient compensation." Izuku was unsure of what was happening to him, so he questioned, what power? He knew it would help Kish live longer. It sounded now as though Kish would be helping him out. Yes, in fact. I witnessed what transpired earlier in the park. Kish appeared to be answering more than just his query. You are a courageous young man, and we will honor your help. Because of our link, you will have the ability to become the hero you have always wanted to be. I will show you how to wield the power I offer you, but it will take some time to master. The alterations to your body will last long after I depart from this life, so you will always have access to this power. Despite the fancy phrases Kish was using, Izuku was beginning to become thrilled and seemed to comprehend everything well. From the way it sounded to him, it was almost like Izuku was going to receive his own quirk. He could feel something in his brain that he could only describe as laughter as his thoughts raced ahead of him. That might be the easiest way to describe the procedure. He thought Kisha's voice sounded really funny, and an outsider would undoubtedly think the same. The versatility of my kind's ability beyond the imagination of your scientists. The majority of those skills will be lost after assimilation, but the ones that are left will be beneficial to you. Your physique will transform over the next few days, and you will acquire new skills. What kind of abilities? Izuku was always ready to learn and, had he been able, he would have been jumping around like a spring. There would be a quirk for him. Even if he wasn't born with one, there was no excuse for him not to find out about it right away if he did have one now. A negative sound was made in his head by Kish. What this power will be is unknown. In the period I have been traveling, I have made several physical adjustments. We'll have to wait and observe until the modifications start happening before I can provide you instructions. Izuku was a little let down by that, but eventually he would gain some sort of awesome power. His mind started racing with ideas of joining UA and rising to fame as a hero. Regretfully, it appeared that he had used up all of his remaining energy. Unaware of his mother, Izuku smiled slightly as he drifted off to sleep. The following morning, Izuku was shaken awake by his mother. He stifled a yawn and sat up slowly, feeling his muscles and joints stiffen and ache. He wasn't sure if this was from Kisha's method or from his interaction with Kachan yesterday. With no comment, Inko Midoriya started to closely inspect her kid, little by bit. After ensuring that everything was appropriate on him, she took a step back and folded her arms. Izuku, I want you to tell me what happened last night. Izuku raised his head to face his mother, expressionless. In its sleep-addled state, his mind was having difficulty deciphering what she was talking about. It occurred to him that she would have no way of knowing about Kish and their agreement, but he saw that it might not be a good idea to tell anyone about it. Don't give me that look. I know you were fighting with Bakugo, and I want to know what happened. I found you passed out on the bench at the park, his mum said. I was worried sick that you hadn't come home yet, and when I found you it was obvious you'd been beaten up. Izuku responded, I had to, his previous yawn returning for a moment. Kachan was going to hurt another kid. I couldn't let him do that without trying to stop him. Oh, Izuku. His mother covered her mouth with her palm as her eyes started to water as he spoke. She knelt in front of him, grasped his shoulders, and met his eyes. She said, You are such a brave little boy and I'm proud of you for standing up for others. Her voice began to sound proud, but soon anxiety and grief took over. I just wish you would think about your own safety more. You don't have a quirk, and if anything ever happened to you I don't know what I'd do. Izuku began to cry as soon as Inko embraced her son tightly. I'm sorry Mom, he replied, I just couldn't help it. Kachan was being mean and he started using his quirk, so I jumped in front of him and told him I'd stop him. I couldn't watch him hurt someone else, Mom. He felt his mother give him a gentle back rub. Izuku bowed silently into his mother's shoulder. I know you couldn't, honey, but I just want you to be more careful from now on. All right, Inko replied. She released him and got to her feet. I called the school to let them know you'd be taking the day off. I want you to rest today. I'll make some breakfast now that you're up. Get dressed and come to the kitchen. He nodded once more and she left the room. Izuku was getting dressed when Kish started talking to him, and he almost burst out of his skin. I've been keeping an eye on your health all night. The process of absorption appears to be almost finished. Maybe tomorrow we'll know exactly what kind of power you're going to get. As long as you don't go overboard, moving around should be okay for the time being. Izuku covered his heart and took long breaths, trying to slow down the quick beat of his vital organ. Kish expressed regret and pledged to give notice before commenting going forward. After putting on his clothes, Izuku went outside to the kitchen, where his mother was just hanging up the phone. With a sigh, she returned to the stove to finish cooking the rice for his morning meal. Inko brought his rice and placed it next to his miso soup and other items as he sat in a chair. Who was on the phone, Mom? He inquired, looking up at her as he started to eat. She sighed again as she turned to face him. She sat down and started making what looked like a shopping list. That was your father. It seems he's being transferred again and will be working in South Korea for the next 6 months. He's going to be able to make it back for your next birthday, but he won't be able to come home for Christmas or New Year's. Oh. Izuku's father has been employed overseas for a while. He had put in a lot of overtime even before moving overseas, so Izuku hardly ever saw him. He met his father in person a few times a year over the holidays and was able to video chat with him once a month or so on average. It appeared that this year he would see him even less. There were no major incidents during the day, and everything was tranquil. His mother was surprised there hadn't even been much in the news that day. After being told to take a break, Izuku spent some time on the internet and eventually ended up lying in his room, attempting to loosen up his stiff joints. He hoped he wouldn't miss much at school. He had to keep his grades up if he wanted to go into UA one day. All Might had attended Japan's top hero school before rising to the position of the country's most popular hero. Izuku noticed a persistent itching in a few areas on his body before going to sleep that night. His arms and legs itched a little in different places, but the worst thing was that his whole back seemed to be tingling. Kish had remained largely quiet during the day, and Izuku assumed this was because he was attempting to determine what kind of power he would ultimately possess. Despite his frustration, he couldn't quite recall how he managed to drift off to sleep that evening, but he managed to doze off deeply. When he woke up the following morning, he heard his mother screaming. Izuku was so shocked and confused that he stumbled out of bed and onto his floor. Inko Midoriya had screamed. He struggled to free himself from his blankets and stuck his head out to see what was happening. His mother's expression was a mixture of shock, perplexity, and almost terrifying. He said, "What's wrong, Mom?" But Inko could only gesture in his general direction. He turned to check behind him, but there was nothing unusual to see. The reason his bed was disorganized was because his sheets had fallen to the ground with him. He glanced back at his mother, who continued to point, and scratched his head, attempting to pinpoint the exact cause of her agitation. But as his arm moved in front of his face, he became aware that the flesh down his arm and on the back of his hand had changed slightly from the previous night in terms of both color and texture. There was now a covering of thick hide in the shape of a hexagon where there had formerly been normal, if pale, human skin. A little worried now, he undid his nightshirt to take a closer look. The hide began at the back of his hand and went up his arms to his shoulders. Feeling around, he saw that the hide covered his entire back, reaching his sides. The hide also covered his legs in a similar manner, going all the way to his buttocks and back. If Izuku had to think about it, he kind of enjoyed the blue-green hue that the hide had all over it. He felt a wondering feeling and called out to Kish. "Indeed, Izuku. My body has bestowed upon you this ability. It is similar to armor plating, I think. The thick hide is just starting to develop, and it appears that your bones have been strengthened. It appears like you will be able to manage it, but we still need to figure out how." With a quiet "Wumph," a bundle of garments fell suddenly into Izuku's face as he was busy inspecting himself. While he had been processing all of this, his mother had been going through his drawers. "Izuku honey," she exclaimed, "get dressed. We're going to the hospital, now." She stumbled out of the room in a state of panic, and Izuku began making his bed and putting on his clothing. His attempts to straighten up were short-lived as his mother seized him and pulled him out of their flat. She called for a cab, and in just 10 minutes, they arrived at the closest hospital's emergency room. Izuku began to worry about Inko's terror and he asked her whether she was okay. "Thank you for your concern, honey, but it's you I'm worried about." They didn't have to wait long because it appeared she had called the doctor to let him know they would be there while he was getting ready. He recognized the tall, thin doctor who entered the room from his previous encounters. He had short purple hair. While his mother attempted to obtain answers from the physician, Izuku remained seated on the examination table. Frantically, "What is going on?" she exclaimed. She pointed at Izuku with several jerky motions, and the doctor made a pacifying gesture by holding up his hands. 3 years ago they tell me he'll be quirkless for life and now he's got some kind of growth on him after a scuffle with a classmate. While his mother didn't exactly calm down, she was able to control her panic a little bit better as the doctor sent Izuku for x-rays and blood tests. "Please calm down, Mrs. Midoriya," the doctor said. "I'm sure we can figure all of this out if you just give me some time to look things over and run some tests." The peculiar nature of the case led him to prioritize everything, and they received the results in about an hour. Additionally, the doctor had taken out a tablet and was flipping through what appeared to be journals and scientific publications. "All right, Mrs. Midoriya," the physician said. "We have the results of the tests and your son's x-rays back and everything looks normal across the board. Nothing has significantly changed in the last 3 years in respect to his biology that we can tell." Yes, was Inko's succinct response. Her patience was quickly wearing thin. Her foot was bouncing frantically, and she was holding her handbag with a white-knuckled clutch. Fine. But what is going on? She asked. I've been going over some medical journals in the meantime, and it seems like your son may have gone through a phenomenon being called sudden onset quirk development metamorphosis. The physician continued with his explanation. There is a chance, he stated, a very small chance in roughly 0.0001% of the Quirkless population that a dormant quirk gene can activate later in life. It hasn't been observed more than twice in the last century, so it's not something we look out for. The doctor massaged the bridge of his nose and said, even if that's the case, Inko remarked, no one in my or my husband's family has a quirk like this. Where did this come from? He held up a hand to stop Inko's questioning, saying, while there have been many studies conducted into quirks and their origins, we still only have the most basic understanding of the phenomenon. He gestured to all of the charts from Izuku's testing and said, it has been observed that on occasion a unique quirk will manifest even from the most stable bloodlines. While not common, it isn't unheard of. As I said before, your son is perfectly healthy and there don't seem to be any deformities. I think your son just happened to be an anomaly, a case that is rarely seen that bloomed later than expected. Perhaps the fight he had triggered the metamorphosis as a defense mechanism. With a smile, the doctor turned back to face Izuku. He nodded and turned back to face Inko. It seems like he might be able to become a hero after all, he said, looking back at Inko. Seems like a stroke of luck to me. Even so, his mother appeared less anxious and more composed than before. Izuku felt a little more at ease as a result. The doctor and his mother carried on their chat, but his thoughts began to stray. He contacted Kish shortly after, wanting to ask some things. Izuku, what is it? Kish inquired. Kish seemed to consider that, as he did not immediately respond. Well, he pondered, something I don't quite get is where your body went. You were so much bigger than me, but now all of that is gone. I'll do my best to clarify, said Kish. I detected several radio waves originating from your planet while I was in space. Many of your experts have declared that star stuff makes up all life on your planet. This holds true for the entire cosmos. Izuku paid close attention, recalling a few of the shows he had watched on the topic. Although the components of my body were created inside stars much like yours, my type has far more control over that stuff. I was aware of what needed to be kept and what didn't for our merger. I just abandoned the things I didn't need, and they eventually fell apart. Izuku asked, a little perplexed, so it went poof and disappeared? Not quite, Kish remarked. It disintegrated into separate atoms and vanished into the atmosphere of your planet. Oh, Izuku seemed to get that bit. So you took what you needed and let the other stuff break up and go away. Indeed. I allowed the most crucial components to integrate with your body. Izuku thought about that for a moment. Even while it appeared straightforward, he wasn't quite sure how that operated. Either way, he now had an explanation, and it answered most of his questions. Okay, he replied, the next question I had was, how can I hear you in my head? Do you have telepathy? I am speaking to you in a manner that is quite close to what some call telepathy. The primary distinction is that, in comparison to your species, we have extremely strong minds and have evolved methods of using them. Izuku only listened, but Kish made it sound nearly magical. I just gave my mind permission to occupy some unoccupied space in your mind, since our minds are flexible like our bodies are. Izuku questioned, so you're inside my head with me? That had a strange yet cool sound to it. That, I guess, is the most straightforward explanation, indeed. With a, okay, Izuku answered. For now, he was happy with Kish's responses, though he might have to ask him some more later. He was wondering if he could go home soon as he started to listen to what the grown-ups in the room were saying. In closing, the doctor said, so I recommend he takes today off, and goes back to school on Monday. It felt like a lengthier speech. Izuku looked up at his mother and saw that she was much more at ease than she had been moments before. Get him to a quirk counselor as soon as possible to discuss his abilities, and just support him as best you can. He hated to worry his mother, so he was relieved to see this. Even if his mother hadn't given him the advice he needed at the time, in his opinion, she was the best mother in the world. Izuku spent his weekend trying to understand how his newfound powers operated. He and Kish had done some experimenting and found that the hex design was functional as well as a thick layer of hide across his limbs and back. He could grow scales and larger armor plates by stretching the hexes from his skin. He'd spent his time rolling the plates out to a meager half-inch in diameter and stretching them to their absolute maximum. Izuku found it unusual and exciting to discover the method for activating his powers, which were quite astounding. He discovered that using his quirk for an extended period of time seemed to fatigue him, but he was able to carry on experimenting after a short break of an hour or so and some food. His mother had located a quirk counselor who could make an appointment very quickly, so on Sunday they went to Yamazaki Kumiko's office. The space at Ms. Yamazaki's office was open and inviting. A few windows in the waiting room let in the midday sun. A large coffee table was placed in the center, flanked by a number of magenta seats and a subdued blue couch positioned around the walls. The front door to the reception window and all their directions were covered in plush brown carpeting. The waiting area was vacant, so the two didn't have to wait long. After being led into another room with several more pink chairs waiting, the door opened again and Ms. Yamazaki entered a few minutes later. If Izuku had correctly estimated her height, she was a woman of average height, only marginally taller than his mother. Her blue eyes were piercing and her brown hair reached her shoulders. She faced the two of them as she took a seat in a chair and introduced herself. "So, Mrs. Midoriya, Izuku, could you please explain why you are in my office today? You know, Ms. Yamazaki, with his quirky nature, my Izuku looks to be a bit of a late bloomer. He developed it 3 whole years later than everybody else, and neither my spouse nor I have anything like it. I was hoped you could explain everything to Izuku." Ms. Yamazaki hummed as she flipped through some papers on a clipboard and tugged absently at her shirt. Izuku had to look away when he realized the orange cardigan the woman was wearing was a little too tight around her. He tried to push the thought from his mind and stifle a blush. "Yes, I see," she said, setting the clipboard on a table to one side and crossing her legs. "Izuku is quite a unique case. It's amazing how uncommon something like this is, but there's no reason why we can't bring him up to date." After a few more minutes of back and forth with his mother, Ms. Yamazaki asked if he could speak with him alone for a little while. Inko agreed and left the room, leaving Izuku alone with Ms. Yamazaki, if you didn't count Kish being there. Inko and Kumiko spoke for a short while, and Ms. Yamazaki assured his mother that she would try her best to make sure everything was okay with Izuku before they left. "Izuku, could you please tell me what has been going on these past few days? Rarely does a quirk appear thus late in life. Perhaps there was a trigger." With her legs still crossed, Izuku watched her foot as it bounced up and down, following one polished heel as it traced a circle in the air. After a moment, he decided it was best to keep that part to himself and recounted the events of the last few days, carefully cutting out the part where he met a literal space alien. When he finished, Kumiko leaned back in her chair and adopted a thinking pose, one hand curled into a fist in front of her mouth, and hummed thoughtfully. "Little man, why does it feel like you're keeping something from me?" Izuku tried to look away or focus somewhere else, but Kumiko's piercing blue eyes seemed to draw in his own green eyes. He swallowed hard and tried to think of something to say, but his mind was blank and his thoughts were jumbled. She was staring at him intently as she spoke and she leaned forward in her seat. Izuku was startled for a moment before he felt a comforting nudge from the back of his mind. Once he realized what had happened, he relaxed and watched as Ms. Yamazaki smiled while trying not to laugh. Then, his mouth started to move without his input and he heard his voice as if from far away. "Okay. I guess I tried to save a kitty from a tree too, but that didn't work out so well either." "I see," she said, leaning back and crossing her arms over her chest. "It seems like you have a strong desire to become a hero." He pushed that thought away once more. "It seems to me that the quirk you manifested is well suited for a hero who keeps trying to save people," he said, his face flushing slightly from the smile she was giving him. Trying to protect another boy from bullies and trying to save a kitty from a tree, all without a quirk. Izuku's mind began to race at this point, and he asked in a serious tone, "Really?" The excitement was clear in his voice and there was a definite shine in his eyes. "How?" Ms. Yamazaki gave a nod. "Obviously. With sufficient skill and experience, you could truly use your armor to protect people. Could you explain the process to me?" She asked him to extend scales from other parts of his body, even having him remove his shirt for a minute or two, and after a thorough examination of his abilities she sat back in her chair and flipped through her papers again. Izuku eagerly thrust his arm in front of him, where he extended his scales out, then expanded the one on the back of his hand out to its maximum width. She crossed her legs again, gripping her knee with her hands. Unlike many quirks that have serious drawbacks to them, yours has relatively few that I can determine right now. This quirk is quite a bit more powerful than your parents, she said. I can see you being able to expand those plates to quite a large extent in the future. Your main priority right now is to stay away from weariness. Just like anything in gym class, using your quirk requires energy. You have to be careful not to overdo it until you acquire the endurance to use your quirk for longer periods of time. Izuku listened carefully, then reached for a notebook, something he had been doing more and more of late. He carried a notebook nearly everywhere he went, and had been writing down as much as he could about heroes to study them. He thought this was a good time to record the most significant details of his new powers. At the moment, your armor is still a little bit pliable. You can adjust the hardness or softness over time based on your needs, but until you know where your boundaries are, you should refrain from attempting to stop anything that is moving quickly or with excessive force. Normally I would have to talk about using your quirk on other people and where the line is according to the law, but I think you understand that from what your friend has put you through in the last few years, so be careful until you've had time to explore those limits. She paused to give him time to finish writing down what she'd said before continuing. That sharp blue gaze was peering into Izuku's once again when he looked up from his notebook. I think it's quite sweet of you to think of Kachan as your friend, but I think you might need to avoid him for a bit, Izuku said. He shuddered slightly at her severe demeanor. You might be able to be friends again one day, but it might not be for a while, she said. I've counseled quite a few children like him, and they don't change so easily. Avoid overexerting oneself and don't be reluctant to meet new people. Izuku closed his notebook and nodded. In any case, please don't hesitate to come see me if you have any questions or concerns in the future, regarding your peculiarity or anything else. Izuku was taken aback by Kumiko's kind grin and thought it wouldn't be too horrible to return at a later time if he needed to talk. I'll be happy to help you in any way I can, Izuku said. He was scheduled for another appointment in 6 months, and he could feel himself looking forward to it. Ms. Yamazaki gave him a few more words of caution before walking him out of the office and into the waiting room, where she spoke with his mother for a few more minutes. Izuku stood outside the gates to Hanasoru Primary School. It was Monday again, and that meant he would be returning to classes. His mother had come with him and she ushered him into the school's main office. She had brought a doctor's slip and was explaining the reason for his absence to the office staff. It only took a few minutes, but for him it felt like hours. His nerves were shot, and he couldn't help playing out scenarios in his mind about how his classmates would react to his new abilities. Of course, the one reaction he was most apprehensive about was Bakugo. He wasn't sure what had happened with his one-time friend since their encounter that Wednesday afternoon. It felt almost like a lifetime ago. Before too long his mother said goodbye and promised to have dinner ready when he got home. Now alone, the walk to his classroom felt more like a death march. His stomach was forming into knots and his mouth was starting to feel dry. Before he'd even gotten halfway to his class he felt as though his stomach would revolt. Calm down, Izuku, Kish interjected. There is nothing to be afraid of. If Bakugo tries anything, I am sure an instructor will intervene. Even if one does not, you have a means to defend yourself now. Izuku took a few deep breaths to settle his stomach and nerves. Kish was right after all. He held his head up high, and took the last few steps to stand in front of the door to his classroom. With one more deep breath he slid open the door and stepped into the room. His teacher, a rather dumpy woman with feathers sprouting from her arms, stood in front of the class taking roll. She stopped and looked over and smiled. Oh, she said, Midoriya, I was just about to call your name. Kindly have a seat. As he looked around, he saw that almost every student was staring at him. Katsuki was adamantly averting his gaze, and Izuku was not sure how to interpret that. He felt a little subdued, though, and many of the students who had never paid him any attention before were openly staring at him. Despite this discomfort, he tried to concentrate on the lessons, and the day went by slowly. Several times, he noticed that students were staring at him rather than the teacher. It was an odd feeling to be the center of attention for once, and he didn't know how to act. When break started, he was inundated with questions and the crowd's influx completely confused him. He tried to respond as best he could, but the questions kept coming, and after a short while, the crowd started to thin out and Bakugo and his posse moved towards him. Izuku swallowed hard and braced himself in case he had to defend himself, and Bakugo stopped when they were only a few arms' length away. Izuku held his gaze, unsure but not willing to back down, and Bakugo answered, "I don't know how you got a quirk, and I don't care what it is," crossing his arms and snorting. "All I got to say is stay out of my way." Bakugo didn't say anything at first, just stared Izuku down. After giving Izuku a fierce look for a minute, Bakugo pivoted and walked to the opposite side of the playground, saying, "You don't get in the way of me being the #1 hero and I won't beat the tar out of you." While a few of the other children followed him, others dispersed to other parts of the playground. Two remained to ask him questions. A girl named Suzuhara Naomi who had a water control quirk and a boy named Nishimura Taro who had a needle-producing quirk. These two spent the remainder of playtime hanging out with him, and he gradually began to make friends with them despite the fact that he didn't know their names from class. It was nice not to have to worry about his safety every day, but Izuku couldn't help but feel like something was missing from his life. He and Kachan had been friends since kindergarten, or at least Izuku had thought they were. He wasn't sure exactly where things had gone wrong, and he sorely wished he and Bakugo could find a way to be friends again. The rest of the day went by without any more fanfare, and Izuku found himself enjoying school considerably more than he had enjoyed it over the previous few years. But Izuku thought back to the words Ms. Yamazaki had said to him not one day before and sighed. Maybe one day he and Katsuki could be close again, but until then, they would just have to avoid each other. That year passed quickly and before Izuku knew it, his 8th birthday had rolled around. His father returned home for it, and he etched Hisashi's appearance in his mind. Tall and slim, the Midoriya patriarch's appearance could almost be mistaken for an older Izuku. His face was quite similar and was covered in just as many freckles. Hisashi had the same mop of unruly hair only colored black. He lit the candles on the birthday cake with a small flaming breath. After blowing out those candles, Izuku's family gathered together in a tight group hug, each one of them shedding emotional tears over the miracle that had blessed them. Hisashi's brown eyes sparkled with unshed tears as he promised to never miss a birthday, no matter how far away he was sent to work. They all hugged once more before digging into the cake and spent as much time together that day as they possibly could. Lots of tears were shed in the Midoriya house, and Izuku was not afraid to admit his family were an emotional lot. Even with his newfound popularity, Izuku kept mostly to himself at school. He had begun working out after school, using a weight set his father had given him for his birthday. His habit of collecting hero information had intensified, and while out and about he often found himself jotting down everything he could about any hero or villain he saw in the streets, on television, or on the internet. 3rd and 4th grade passed without much incident, and most of 5th was peaceful as well. As time passed his armor plating had begun to harden and take on a more pronounced teal hue. He also noticed that when he would practice raising and expanding his plates, they became darker and shinier when his quirk was in use. Izuku's quirk had grown significantly by the 2nd trimester of 5th grade. He could now expand his plates to a diameter of nearly 6 inches and extend them a full 2 inches. This was helpful because, at that same time, Bakugo started acting more aggressively and frequently threw his weight around the school. Shortly after summer break in September, one of Izuku's friends, Nishimura Taro, was the victim of one of Bakugo's outbursts of aggression after Nishimura had bumped into Bakugo during. "Don't think you can get away without punishment for attacking me," Bakugo said, growing too agitated to listen to Taro's attempts at an apology. He screamed at the boy who was thinner. When things got out of hand, Izuku had been sitting out the game reading a book on quirk training when he heard Taro's voice across the yard and had gotten closer to see if he was all right. "It was an accident, I swear," Taro said, backing up slowly until he reached a fence where he could no longer retreat. "I didn't mean to." "Stop talking, jerk." Taro would not be able to escape unharmed if Bakugo struck him with an explosion-augmented right hook that was aimed directly at his head, even with his arms shielding his face. That was when it first happened. Without a thought, Izuku's body moved on its own. His legs carried him to the space in front of his friend, and his right arm raised in front of him. 4 hex plates raised and expanded in seconds to form a shield just big enough to protect from the blast. It hurt when the explosion went off, but Izuku knew those explosions could hurt much more from experience. The armor plating had done its job and softened the impact enough to stop any serious injury. "Deku!" yelled Bakugo, What the fuck do you think you're doing, an idiot? A teacher was walking across the yard, staring at Bakugo with a stern gaze. So Bakugo, surprised and furious, pulled back for another swing, but before he could get the hang of it, a loud whistle was sounded. What's happening over here? Izuku recognized him as the PE teacher, big, beefy, and intimidating, as the teacher asked. Everything Bakugo stated was, nothing. Why am I not convinced by you? Shikimura, what happened? He turned to face Izuku and Taro. After taking a swift swallow, Taro stated, there is a miscommunication. I bumped him on accident. He almost quailed under Bakugo's glare, but with Izuku nearby he found the confidence to continue. I tried to apologize but he tried to hit me with his quirk. Midoriya kept me safe. Is this true? All right, the teacher said. Come with me Bakugo, we're going to have a little talk with the counselor. Bakugo simply scoffed and started walking towards the school building, but before he could follow, the teacher looked at Izuku once more. You should go to the infirmary and get your arm checked out. Izuku could only nod at that point because he was going through some things in his head. Although using oddities on school property is prohibited, I believe we can get away with it this one. Izuku turned to Taro after the teacher departed and inquired about his well-being. Iya. The other boy tried to calm himself, saying, I'm fine. Man, you saved my bacon. Midoriya. Thanks buddy. Izuku blushed and waved it off, but Taro insisted, if you ever need anything, just let me know man. I owe you. With that Taro made his way back to the school building. Izuku talked to Kish in his brain as he followed and made his way to the hospital. Did you do that? Make me move my body? Kish remarked, I have very limited control over your body. I can at most make you speak or twitch some fingers, which left Izuku perplexed. I couldn't have. What then transpired just now? My body just moved by itself. He had heard of things like this happening, but he had never experienced it before. Your body moved as if it already knew what to do. Kish stated that it appeared as though you acted only based on instinct. This behavior is common in many animals, including humans. As he went into the infirmary, Izuku considered that. The school nurse cleaned his arms of small burns and looked at one of his cracked plates, speculating that it would either heal itself or that he would molt the damaged plate and grow a new one instead. She didn't know which would happen, so she wrapped his arm and sent him back to class. Later, Izuku discovered that damaged plates did indeed molt, and the new plate took several days to grow and harden. He stored that information for later use. Okay, class. Today, we will be learning about how our bodies use the minerals in food to create our bones and how some animals make their shells, said Izuku's middle school biology teacher, tapping the blackboard with a 1-meter ruler to get the class's attention. Izuku perked up at the description of their lesson, and as he took notes and listened to the teacher, he reached into the back of his mind for Kish. His passenger didn't respond right away, and Izuku was reminded that sometimes it took a few minutes for Kish to rise from his sleep. The lecture droned on and the teacher noted that depending on an animal's diet, different minerals were used to construct the more solid parts of its body, and while this was prevalent in human bodies as bones, fingernails, and even hair, many animals and insects used it to make shells or exoskeletons. Kish's mind slowly rose from the depths of his consciousness. What is it, Midoriya? He asked. He began, today in class we're learning about biomineralization, and I was wondering if there was anything I could consume to make my armor harder. Kish's mind took a minute to reply, obviously puzzling it out. For that purpose I recommend a diet high in protein and iron. Kish had been slow to awaken and sluggish when responding over the last couple of months. Izuku knew that he was getting ready to hibernate again. They had agreed on the term as the best analog to what was happening. Kish would sometimes go into a much deeper sleep than normal to conserve energy, and in the lead up to one of these hibernation sessions he would be less responsive. In another few weeks Izuku would not be able to talk to Kish at all. Protein will help with general growth and health of the carapace, while iron will be instrumental for increasing the hardness and durability of your plates. Izuku had learned to quickly jump back and forth between what was going on in his head, and what was happening out in the world around him. It had become necessary so that he could still walk and talk among other things when conversing with Kish. You're getting ready for hibernation cycle again, aren't you? Izuku had been through this before, but it was always a little weird and lonely without the constant presence of his passenger in his thoughts. Sure, he could still sense Kish where he always was, but his awareness wasn't there and he had grown so accustomed to it that he felt empty without it. Yes. It will not be long now. How much longer is it this time? Izuku inquired, looking a little worried. Do you know? It had been growing longer with each cycle. The previous one had lasted 3 months. It felt like it would be much longer than previously, but I'm not sure. Kisha's voice was slower and more quiet now. Izuku chewed on his rubber and said, okay. As he resumed taking notes, he felt his passenger's awareness slip back into the corner of his consciousness. Throughout the past 6 years, Kish had grown to be one of Izuku's closest friends. Since that night in the summer of his 2nd year of elementary school, Kish had supported him through many hardships, and it always bothered him when he couldn't get in touch with him. He knew that contact was essential and that Kish would eventually disappear forever, but Izuku didn't like to think about that possibility. Ultimately, he knew it would happen, but his anxiety would flare whenever the thought occurred to him. He just hoped it wouldn't be too long till his buddy and mentor returned to him. Alas, he would have to cope with it for however long it took. Before Izuku knew it, the lunch bell was ringing. The lecture had shifted to other topics related to biology and what would probably be covered in the next quiz. He packed up and went to the cafeteria, where he sat down at his usual table, selecting one of the less expensive lunch sets. A moment later, a new person took the seat across from him, and he looked up to see his friend Naomi, who, unless Bakugo counted, was the only friend he had left from primary school. Izu, what's wrong? He momentarily frowned as her voice jolted him out of his trance. He stirred at something that appeared to be tapioca on his platter and said, just feeling a little off, Suzuhara. Happens sometimes. It seems like every a year or so, you go through this malaise. Naomi was a sensitive girl, and Izuku enjoyed her company. Yeah, I noticed. It's been making him feel a little queasy lately, but not in a bad way. He felt his cheeks burn and he pushed the thought away. I don't know what's wrong, but I know you always come out of it with a smile, so I'm sure you'll be back to yourself in no time, she said, her blue eyes scrunched up. He picked at his food and added, I just start to feel a little empty sometimes is all. Naomi turned her head to one side, slightly taken aback by his statement but still grinned. After a short while of silent eating, they both turned to face the commotion coming from the cafeteria entrance, where Bakugo had just made his grand entrance. As usual, his temper was still as bad as ever, but at least his aggression seemed to be limited to verbal lashings. He hadn't attacked anyone in years, not physically anyway. Izuku turned away as he saw the expression on his friend's face. Although he was happy to have Naomi as a friend and appreciated her company, their relationship had become more complicated recently. Since she started attending Mustafa Middle School, she had been showing more interest in Bakugo. Izuku sensed that their relationship was changing, though he wasn't sure why, based on how he felt when he spoke to her and how she looked at Bakugo. His stomach dropped at the simple act of her pulling a lock of her black hair back behind her ear while she continued to watch the boisterous group across the hall. He wished Kish wasn't going into hibernation, needed advice, and didn't know who to ask besides his best friend and confidant because it was all so confusing. Perhaps he would call his father one day this week. Naomi hardly noticed when he stood up to go, deciding he wasn't all that hungry, and he returned his tray and went back to the classroom. Izuku sat on his bed, phone in one hand and face in the other, the blush not going away quickly enough for him to like. He should have known his father would be embarrassing, as he'd always been that way, but he'd been fairly effective at bringing his son up to speed on just what was going on between Izuku and his friends. Of course I'm in the middle of a love triangle. He really wished Kish was awake, as the alien entity had disappeared since he'd last spoken to his passenger and best friend. It might be months before the two could communicate, and Izuku could employ the cool-headedness of Kish's entire life. With a sigh of frustration, he shoved his cell phone into his pocket and thought that maybe a run through town would help him work out his frustrations and muscles together. After telling his mother where he was going, he left the apartment and started with a brisk walk to warm up his muscles. He was fairly proud of the progress he'd made in his training since he'd started middle school. He'd done some lightweight training since he'd gotten his quirk in 2nd grade, but since graduating while he was no All Might, still scrawny and awkward as ever, he wasn't a weakling in any sense. He was still a bit anxious about his appearance though, and had taken to wearing loose-fitting clothes so as not to draw attention to himself. Izuku was no longer an outcast at school and had friends and acquaintances to spare. He was still no social butterfly. That combined with Bakugo's ruthless dominance of the social order had kept him with only a few people he could socialize with regularly. Naomi had been his friend since that day in primary school, so even with her recent drifting he could probably count on her being his friend for a long time to come. That would depend, of course, on how their little emotional mess played out on the other end. His muscles warmed up sufficiently, so Izuku stepped up to a jog and let his mind go into overdrive. It was going to be close, he knew. He knew that his own feelings for Naomi went a little beyond simple friendship, but there was no denying that he'd never have the courage to admit that to anyone. Especially not her. The very thought made his stomach turn and his chest tighten. The big question would be how Bakugo responded, if and when Naomi confessed to him. Fate was a cruel mistress, indeed, because no matter how many years had passed, he and Bakugo had always found themselves in the same class. Izuku knew Bakugo well enough to know that romance was not something the boy thought about at all. His mind was hyper-focused on one thing: getting into UA and becoming the #1 hero. Izuku also had designs on that, but it was best to keep such things quiet. Izuku had to escape colliding with a mother and her toddler by sidestepping them when she turned a curve. Izuku's mind refocused and picked up its last thread: UA High, the most prestigious hero school in all of Japan. All Might had graduated with honors from UA and become the greatest hero in generations. The symbol of peace. I puffed out, giving the little girl a smile and a wave. The streets were getting busy and he decided to cut down an underused road that went under a pedestrian bridge to avoid any more close calls. Izuku had a plan for both physical and quirk training until the entrance exams, which were just a year and a half away. With that thought in mind, he turned down another road that led towards the sea, and after a few more minutes of jogging, he stopped at Dagoba Beach. The beach was in disarray, with trash of all shapes and sizes scattered across the sand from dumping sites where people had just tossed their trash in the ocean. 2 birds, 1 stone. Izuku paused to catch his breath and gather his thoughts as he watched the waves break against the coast. This was a project he'd been thinking about for a few months and he'd finally decided to take on. Kish had agreed that it was a good plan, and now was the right time to implement it since Izuku would need something to keep his mind occupied while his mentor was hibernating. It was now or never, and he'd be damned if all of this went to waste, so Izuku took off again, headed home, finishing up his plans for the next 18 months. N. Sorry X. I forgot to add the author's note last time. Kish isn't a Marvel symbiote, and he won't be supporting Lethal Force unless it's the only option, which is unlikely. Other than that, I'm glad people are enjoying my story so far. I'm more than a few chapters ahead of schedule, but I'm still trying to make sure everything is up to snuff before posting. Unless I hit one hell of a snag, I'll probably post on Saturday nights. For the time being, I'll be hitting most of the major milestones in the manga, anime. I'm not sure how much the story will diverge, so I'll take each development as it comes. I'm just going to try to shake things up so that it doesn't seem too much like the show. There will be the occasional difference. I don't see much sense in not using such a good roadmap for now. I might not be able to use it in the future, but for now, I'll be doing my thing while running concurrently with Canon. Izuku stood on Dagoba Beach, watching the sun peak above the horizon as dusk slowly receded. Here's to another chapter and maybe some positive feedback from you all soon. He pondered whether he would be able to spot the constellation that Kish had told him about all those years ago as the stars gradually stopped twinkling. He did not know the name of any zodiac signs in the west, and he could not recall which one Kish had mentioned. Pisces seemed a bit odd, but he ignored it and let his thoughts wander. In 2 months, he'd made very good headway on cleaning the beach. It was far from immaculate, and he anticipated that it would take a while before he could even start moving the bulkier items, such as refrigerators. He was aware that he would have to return home shortly to prepare for classes. After he came home from his first run, he told his mother what he was doing and why he wanted to do it, and she was okay with it as long as he was careful. Since then, he had maintained a decent routine, making adjustments for summer vacation and the return to school. Izuku realized that clearing everything up would take some time, but that the effort would be worthwhile as it was now the beginning of July. He turned to head back to his flat, knowing that his mother would be preparing a breakfast that would fit his new diet, and absently slipped his shirt back on. As Izuku was leaving the beach, he saw someone else waiting close to the security gates. Normally he would have just ran on without a second thought, but something about the stranger struck him as familiar. Izuku, trying hard not to look, studied his form as she surveyed him. The man's skin stuck to him like there was just bone beneath it. He was tall and pallid. Izuku pondered whether his loose clothing concealed the worst of his malnourishment or was just a comfort measure as it hung loosely over his bony frame. A mop of golden hair lay around his shoulders and framed his face, with two strands resting atop his head. Izuku gave me a stylish snort. He was delighted that Izuku was trying to be discreet, and the man didn't seem to notice his inspection. Something was bothering him, and he was unable to pinpoint the exact location where he had previously seen the man. Izuku attempted to brush it off and made his way home, failing to notice that the man was seeing him leave the scene. He may have sensed the stranger's following eyes if he had been paying enough attention, but he was more concerned with his training. The feeling persisted nevertheless, at the back of his mind. He would be bothered by it for a long time since he would see this person again. In fact, he met the man once more a week later, on a Saturday this time. On weekends, Izuku would spend a few longer hours at the beach because there was more time. Since Sundays were his days off, he reasoned that it would be okay to increase his routine the day before. He sensed the familiar stranger's gaze on him that day, but neither one made an approach. Izuku just chalked it up to amazement that someone would take it upon themselves to haul away all that trash for seemingly no reason. After a week, he was again to the beach, but this time, the man had come before him. With Izuku practicing and the man observing, they went about their business in silence once more. Though it felt a little awkward, he didn't mind if the stranger was staring at him. It took an hour or two for Izuku to hear footsteps approaching him. He thought the stranger had finally come to him as he looked up from where he had been gathering smaller garbage, but he shrank back when he saw Bakugo walking down the beach. His competitor, unusually, has remained silent thus far. Izuku braced himself for a verbal crucible of curses and yelling. Then, when Bakugo stopped a few meters away, he realized with a faint awareness that the stranger was still looking. His eyes were unreadable and there was a scowl on his face that was all too familiar to Izuku, but yet the lad didn't say anything. He resumed gathering rubbish and stuffing it into the black trash bag he had carried that morning after a short while. "What do you want, Kachan?" He hadn't spoken loudly, but he was sure Bakugo had heard him. It was hardly the response Izuku was expecting to hear. "What are you even doing?" Even yet, he continued to clean without looking up. He heard his opponent suck in a sarcastic grin and ask, "What does it matter to you?" Izuku completed packing his suitcase and tied it off, saying, "Whatever I'm doing shouldn't bother you. I don't even know why you're here." He threw it at a few others he had already filled, observing its weight and attempting to mentally calculate its volume. He turned back to Bakugo, eager to hear whatever expletives he would undoubtedly start saying. Izuku could just make out the tone Bakugo was adopting when he said, "This is a waste of time. It's gonna take forever to clean this junk and nobody's going to thank you for it." Izuku didn't understand him because he hadn't heard him speak like this in a while. "So?" he asked in response. Izuku unrolled another bag and resumed snatching up bottles, cans, and other small objects from around him, saying, "I can do it if I want to, and I'm not bothering anyone." The entire time, he could feel Bakugo's gaze on him. "Don't even try to get into UA," was a common statement from his adversary, delivered less angrily this time. Once more, a well-worn statement that lacks bite is, "Even if you get in, you'll be nothing next to me." Izuku questioned, "Why do you even care if I get into UA?" Though his speed had slowed significantly, he continued to pick up the trash around him, asking, "What does it matter if we go to the same high school?" His adversary didn't answer immediately away. "All our lives we've wanted to be heroes. Even if I get into UA, what does that do to you?" he asked. Izuku had just stood there, no longer cleaning. He didn't give Bakugo a look, and he wasn't sure what the real deal was. "Shit," the curse word is practically mumbled. He heard Bakugo turn and start to walk away. "Do whatever you want, Deku. Just stay out of my way and you won't get hurt." Izuku eventually looked up to see the blonde bush of hair bob off as he walked away, saying, "And tell your little girlfriend to stop staring at me." He attempted to dismiss the bizarre nature of everything, even if the non-conversation they had just had was not how he had imagined his morning to go. He abandoned his bag and lifted a tire onto his shoulder, carrying it in one of the full bags to the trash collection location close to the beach's edge. The blonde stranger who had been observing had to pass close to the railing. He was startled out of his trance on the way back by a voice. Izuku was a little startled by the abrupt sound and said, "Is everything okay, young man?" but found the stranger's silky, deep baritone to be strangely comforting. "It's all right," he remarked, turning to face his thin audience. We used to be friends, he stated, but all we do is argue anymore, so I'm surprised he even talked to me. Izuku wondered if he should talk about such matters with someone he hadn't even met, so he inquired, what was all that about? If you don't mind my curiosity, that is. Ultimately, he shrugged and concluded that there was truly nothing to lose. We both want to be heroes. I got my quirk late. He used to beat me up about not having one, but once I got mine we stopped talking. Izuku took hold of his elbow and gave him a tight hug. Izuku sat down and began to draw circles in the sand. He's been really angry and borderline violent for years, saying he's the best and he'll be the #1 hero and nobody can beat him. I don't get why it matters if we both go to the same high school. We both want to go to UA where All Might went, and it's not like it's a guarantee that either one of us will get in, but it doesn't hurt to hope, does it? Izuku was chatting more to himself these days, but it didn't bother him if the stranger paid attention. Maybe telling someone about it would be beneficial for therapy. It feels like somewhere along the line it stopped being this shared dream we both had, and became all about him. Like, he has a powerful quirk and nobody at our school can even come close in terms of sheer strength, but it's not like you can only have one hero from any given school. Lots of people graduate from hero schools all across Japan and... He began to ramble and knew it was something he shouldn't have done. Izuku snapped his lips shut as the stranger noisily cleared his throat, bringing him back from the depths of his thoughts. Izuku's heart began to relax significantly at his silky baritone as he said, "This has been weighing on you for some time, I take it? It seems like perhaps there's a lot of pressure on your classmate." "I guess so." Izuku looked up and saw the man shake his head slightly. "I don't mean to excuse his behavior, as it seems to have caused you some amount of trouble over the years, but perhaps things aren't exactly roses and sunshine for him either." He felt a smile tug at the edges of his mouth and pushed himself back to his feet. "I'm sure if you keep working hard and give your best you can be a plus ultra hero in your own right, so don't let your classmate get you down." Izuku said, "Thank you, sir." Yagi rested his elbows on the railing and let his deep-set, wonderfully blue eyes sweep over the beach out to the horizon. "Please," the man continued, "call me Yagi. It looks like we'll be seeing each other a good bit if you're going to be cleaning this beach up. I've been enjoying the salt breeze here for a few weeks now while I check out this area. I'll be moving here in about a year and I wanted to get a feel for the places and the people." Izuku said to Yagi, "That's a long way away, Mr. Yagi," with an eyebrow lifted. "Seems like you're going out of your way for all that." "Just Yagi if you please, young man." Izuku stuck out his hand and Yagi shook it. "Oh," he continued, "sorry. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Midoriya." Though he ignored the thought, he saw that the man's hold was surprisingly powerful for someone so tiny. "Nice to meet you." For a brief period, Yagi laughed heartily before going into a coughing fit. Izuku thought he saw some blood flecks on the man's arm, but they quickly disappeared. "You as well, my boy," he uttered after regaining his composure. Izuku stared out across the sand, thinking maybe he could see that as well. "And I look forward to seeing the beach when you finish with it. I'm sure it will be a sight to behold when all is said and done." He stretched his arms wide and arched his back, saying, "I hope so." He would take care of that once he got home, but he would need to work out a few kinks in his back first. "I should be getting back now," he stated. "My mother will have lunch ready soon and she'll worry if I'm late." "I'll see you around Midoriya, my boy, so try not to stress too much." "I'll try." It was a month later when Izuku encountered Yagi again. He said he hadn't had time to return to Mustafu since he's been so busy at work. Izuku realized, but he wasn't sure why he was feeling so glad to see the thin man again after all this time. "Yagi, it's okay," he remarked. Yagi pointed to a part of the beach that was nearly free of debris and said, "You've made some good progress here, my boy. Before too long you'll have a place to enjoy yourself after your workout." Izuku gave a brief laugh snort. Without hesitation, Yagi launched Ino a lecture about lifting and moving heavy objects without straining and injuring yourself. "I don't know about that. It seems like it will take the rest of my life to get this place cleaned up, and I have no idea how I'm going to move the refrigerator or the cabinet set." Then he offered him advice on how to maximize the value of the bigger rubbish items. "Wow, Yagi. Did you used to run a gym or something?" "I've spent a good portion of my life with strength training," he responded. "I've had occasion to lift some pretty heavy stuff, and if you don't know what you're doing things can go south real fast. I'm actually proud of you for not jumping the gun up to this point, young Midoriya." It could have ended quite badly for you to try and move those things before you're ready. Izuku blushed slightly at the compliment. He knew that his parents would be proud of him for almost whatever he would have done, even though they didn't know enough about weightlifting and training to truly provide him any advice. It was strange to hear such glowing remarks from someone he hardly knew. "Yagi, thank you," he said. "I'm not sure what to say, but I'm glad to have your advice all the same." "Think nothing of it, young man," he replied. "But tell me, what is your quirk exactly? I notice you have what looks like scales there, but it's always hard to tell what's what with people these days." Izuku put out an arm and pulled one of his plates to its furthest point, saying, "We call it carapace." He developed a built-in buckler shield that grew to a circumference of almost 1 foot and extended outward 6 inches from his skin. Retracting his armor, he moved over to the backpack he carried with him that day. "It seems like a mostly defensive quirk, but I've been experimenting with ways to give it some offensive uses as well." It held his lunch and a few miscellaneous items. After sniffing around inside for a while, he reached into the deepest recesses and extracted a dog-eared notepad titled, "Quirk Analysis and Training Notes." He gave it to Yagi, the thin man, and spoke while he leafed through it. He explained with a backhanded gesture, pushing the plate on the back of his hand at a respectable speed in sync with the arc. "I've been thinking I can use it as a battering ram if I extend the plates out without expanding them, at the same time I punch or kick." As he glanced over a page, the elder man said, "That might not be a bad idea, my boy," and scratched at his chin. The notebook was filled to overflowing with sketches, scribbles, notes, and other markings that suggested ideas and potential research directions. "Did you come up with all of this yourself? It seems like quite the effort was expended here." "Yes," Izuku exclaimed, removing another notepad labeled, "Hero Analysis for the Future Volume." 13 inches from his backpack. Perhaps he had found someone with whom he could share his pastime, as he felt a thrill rise in his chest as he said, "I love picking apart quirks and hero abilities. I've been keeping track of them forever. Heroes are my passion after all." A new hero named Mound Lady made her public debut here recently. She has a peculiar habit of changing her size. She has a lot of potential for hero work, but she always seems to cause a lot of collateral damage. She's popular with the tabloid papers and celebrity blogs because she has a nice figure. Izuku blushed a little at the remark, but he didn't really notice as he continued to enumerate everything he had observed or considered regarding the new hero's recent actions. At the sound of his sole female friend's voice, Izuku's breath seized in his throat. "Geez, Izu. Give the guy a minute." He looked over and saw Naomi standing close by, her cheeky smile making him flush again. He trailed off, not knowing just what to say. "Oh, hi Suzuhara." He sensed that Yagi was staring at him while the older man feigned to leaf through the notes on the hero analysis. "What brings you here?" Izuku was searching for a spot to rest his gaze that wasn't his friend's face, or anyplace else for that matter, when Naomi shook her head. He'd grown more and more nervous and ashamed around her throughout the past trimester of school, and he knew exactly why, but he didn't know how to handle it. She replied, looking over the beach with interested eyes, "I checked with your mum and she said you were here, so I came to check on you. So this is where you've been sneaking off to every weekend. I was starting to think you were just avoiding me." Izuku averted his gaze and started adjusting the hem of his shirt. "Of course not," he said, speaking a little harsher than he had meant to. He could feel his breath become a little ragged the longer she was close. "Just getting serious about hero training is all. Figured someone should do something about all this trash, and decided to turn it into a workout project." He didn't know how much longer he could have this kind of conversation with her. She said, "Oh, cool." Her smile said, "It would be nice to see this place all cleaned up," and for a split second he forgot he was breathing. She slipped a strand of hair behind her ear and said, "Good for you, Izu," before taking another glance around. Izuku's heart fell at the mention of his competitor. "Say, you haven't seen Bakugo around lately, have you?" "You know that he and I don't talk, Suzuhara," he said, allowing his fringe to obscure his vision. His face had gone very pale, and his respiration had stopped. She nodded and grinned once again. "If I had to guess, I think he's probably at the arcade with his buddies again, but I don't know for sure." She turned and waved as she headed back towards the busier areas of town, saying, "Well, don't work too hard, Izu. I'll see you at school." Izuku moaned and buried his face in his fists. Yagi, who had been waiting patiently for everything to happen, gave him a quick pat on the head with his notebook. He accepted the notebook and sighed heavily. "That was more drama than I've seen in a long time. You gonna be okay, kid?" he asked. "Not really." He dropped down to sit on the beach, putting his lunch out and his notebooks back in his bag. "I seem to have gotten myself into an honest-to-goodness love triangle." He observed that Yagi was chuckling. "And the worst part is she's fallen for my former best friend, the one you saw last time." Yagi, who was sitting on the railing above him, remarked, "My boy, that's a tough situation you're in. Can't say as I have any advice for you aside from just telling her how you feel." Izuku almost spilled his meal at the suggestion, saying, "I couldn't do that. I know she doesn't feel the same way about me, and I don't want to ruin everything by confessing." Izuku looked up at him from his spot and raised a curious eyebrow, saying, "My boy, that indecisiveness isn't a good look for someone trying to be a hero. Heroes have to make quick decisions and act with purpose to stay ahead of the villains or head off disaster. The greatest heroes act almost before they've had a chance to think about the situation, but with the ability to adapt on the fly. If you want to be a great hero, you'll need to be able to do what's necessary quickly and without hesitation." His veins froze at the thought, "But what happens if she hates me for it?" From his elevated position, he stared down at Izuku with deep-set eyes, saying, "Then she wasn't as good a friend as you thought." His voice became slightly serious for a second before continuing, "You will hurt, as the heart is wont to do in these situations. Things will change between you for sure after something like that, but if she truly is a friend to you, then she won't try to hurt you. Make no mistake." His tone and face lightened considerably for his next line. "But she'll do her best not to make it any worse than it has to be if she cares about you at all." Izuku ignored the conversation as he consumed the rice and pork cutlet that his mother had brought for him the previous evening. After the emotional roller coaster of the morning, his emotions were all over the place. He became increasingly aware that Yagi's statements rang true the more he considered them. He wasn't sure why he trusted the man so much, but for some reason, he sensed that the man standing over him was offering the wisest counsel possible. Maybe he would wait long enough for things to all happen. It would be better to rip off this bandage as soon as possible to allow the damage to heal. He didn't take long to finish his lunch. As he packed up, he bowed to the man and said, "I think I'll end it here for the day. Thank you so much, Yagi." He then slung his bag over his shoulder. Yagi merely waved him away. Izuku shook his head and trotted out with a wave, saying, "Think nothing of it, young Midoriya. It's the least an old soul can do for such an earnest young man." He caught up with Naomi quickly, and although he hesitated a little, he told her the truth about how he felt. Yagi was correct, and Naomi handled not feeling the same way about him as gently as possible. Naturally, Izuku was distraught, but after crying all night long and keeping it a secret from his mother, he felt as though a burden had been removed. Things were difficult when he saw Naomi again, but quickly they established a new normal. After all, she was his friend. As the weeks went by, Dagoba Beach gradually began to take on the appearance of a place to unwind. Gradually, the garbage was going away, and Izuku could sense his own progress. Izuku occasionally worried that he would never be able to speak with his guru again because Kish had been hibernating for almost 10 months, but his anxiousness was moderated by Yagi's relatively constant presence in his life. In the short time they had known one another, the two had developed a small relationship. Yagi skillfully sidestepped the subject each time Izuku had the slightest notion what he did for a living, so Izuku still didn't know. However, he was beginning to believe that the man was somehow associated with heroes, as he was well versed in the workings of the industry and could provide sound guidance when they discussed his eccentric training concepts. Sometimes the elder man's skeleton vanished for weeks at a time, and Izuku would always worry about him during those times. The elder man appeared weak. He frequently had bloody coughs when he became agitated or overextended himself. He had rationalized this away as a long-standing injury he had received at work, but Izuku was never able to elicit any further information from him. It had gone so quickly, and those few months had seen a lot of events. Naomi had also had her heart broken by Bakugo, even after he had made amends with her. One day, she'd followed him to the arcade, and although he hadn't been too harsh when rejecting her, the two friends who followed him everywhere more than made up for it. She had came crying over to Izuku when he was practicing his fighting techniques in a nearby park, and she had soaked his shirt in her tears. Having been brought up to be such a considerate and courteous boy, he had seen this coming a long way but had never brought it up. Nevertheless, he was annoyed for his close friend and had delivered a verbal abuse to the two fools that could have rivaled one of Bakugo's outbursts. Katsuki refrained from commenting and instead let his friends suffer. For some months, there had been rumors that All Might was in Mustafu. Although Izuku was initially dubious, he had to concede to the truth when he learned that a villain possessing a sludge mutation had attempted to kidnap a person in the market district following an unsuccessful heist. Because of his peculiarity, the victim had given the slime ball a hard time, wasting enough time for the number one hero to arrive and apprehend him. Izuku had intended to discuss it with Yagi, but he had vanished that same week and hadn't been seen for a month. Nevertheless, they had talked about the later announcement that All Might would be joining the faculty at UA High for the upcoming academic year. To Izuku's surprise, Yagi had been evasive about the whole matter. He had added, "I'm sure the man has his reasons." At the time, he had declined to provide any further detail, saying that, dealing with villains in the now is just as important as passing down the lessons of the past to the next generation. Izuku had been too gracious to challenge him on it. Nearly every student in his class aspired to be a hero, and his professors had been focusing more and more on high school entrance examinations. Though Bakugo's ego had been exploding lately, he had considered that several of his classmates may become wonderful heroes with their eccentricities. One day he'd given a stirring speech about how he was the best and would be the only one from this trash junior high to make it to the big leagues. Even after Bakugo had singled him out for verbal abuse, Izuku had remained silent. In the process, his competitor had gone so far as to almost destroy one of his hero analysis notebooks. Fortunately, he had time to fish it out of the koi pond before it caused any irreversible harm. But Kisha's return from hibernation had been the best news Izuku had received. The alien awareness had faint impressions of what had transpired during his almost year-long hibernation, as was typically the case, but Izuku had been more than delighted to have filled in the blanks for him. Kish was happy with his development on the beach and the bond he had developed with Yagi. It says volumes about your maturity that you can confide in someone other than yourself. When he received the remark, Izuku was aware that he appeared quite the sight in the middle of the street, blushing at seemingly nothing. "I'm hoping I won't have to hibernate for a while. I would be delighted to be able to help you with your education and training." That was a statement he had heartily agreed with. The last several weeks before the UA entrance exam had been a haze of intense study and feeling. Izuku was in full swing to complete the beach cleanup, and his emotions had been rising to a climax with the successful placement of the last broken device into the designated garbage pickup area. Izuku had been reveling in the sparkling vision of a pristine stretch of sand and waves when he had almost fallen a good 10 feet from the top of his rubbish pile. He had completed his studies barely 2 days before the entrance exam. "My goodness, young man!" exclaimed Yagi when he saw the seashore after spending several weeks away for work. "You should take pride in this accomplishment. It's a great achievement and a boon for the community." Izuku was a little taken aback by the glowing compliment. If Izuku had been quiet before, he was downright breathless under that declaration. "Izuku, my boy," he said. "I wasn't sure what to make of you when we first met, but I'm certain after all the time I've had to know you that you'll make a splendid hero when all is said and done." He rushed himself at Yagi without thinking and gave him a hug, barely remembering not to move his injuries. Yagi gently ruffled his hair and said, "Thank you so much, Yagi. You don't know how much that means to me." Naturally, Izuku felt confident the man would have passed away from happiness if he had known the man's identity at the time. However, the admission examinations had not yet opened when that realization finally became apparent. After the moment had over, Yagi wished young Midoriya the best of luck. Izuku said he would and walked off to get some rest before school started. "Even if you don't make it into UA, I'm sure that any hero course would be lucky to have you, so go out there and give it your all." After all, he had just 1 day left to study for the examinations. That would be a memorable day. Izuku Midoriya was positive he would never forget the day of the UA entrance examinations even if he lived to be 100 years old. Gazing upward at the 4 towers that comprised the construction, he stood in front of the main building. A walkway flanked each tower on either side. After witnessing Bakugo enter the building, he stood there attempting to calm himself down before going inside himself. If he had been fully in control of his attentions, he would have realized that his shoe was untied and spared himself the humiliation of collapsing face first. He tripped over his own 2 feet and was almost positive he was going to faceplant when he felt the telltale indicators of a fall. He was always surprised that the impact never happened. Rather, he only stood there in midair for a few periods, his thoughts attempting to make sense of what was happening. Prior to him fully understanding why he hadn't collapsed into his face, a soft hand supported and assisted him in standing up straight again. Izuku would subsequently claim that the voice that said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask first," had actually come down from heaven. "I know we're not supposed to use our quirks without permission, but I thought it would be terrible for you to trip and fall before you even made it into the building." Izuku felt his feet sink back into the earth as he turned to look at a round-faced, brown-haired girl putting her fingertips together. The sensation of weightlessness that had overtaken him was so slight that he almost felt his knees give way beneath him. His response was barely audible, but he managed to pull himself together and say, "No, you're fine, thank you." She responded with a smile that almost stopped him in his tracks. "Well, good luck in there," she said as she walked into the building and waved at him. He was not as stable as he would have admitted when it came to walking properly. He eventually managed to enter the hallway and was seated next to Bakugo of all people. The exam steps were explained in a clear and concise manner, although Present Mike's delivery confused a few of them. Even after being called out for his propensity of muttering by a tall boy wearing spectacles, Izuku felt reasonably confident in his ability for the written exam. He saw the brown-haired girl from earlier and the tall boy wearing spectacles when the bus dropped them off at the practical exam location. There were a few more that he thought would be interesting to watch, but aside from a blonde boy with an attractive appearance, he couldn't make out any particular characteristics. Having the foresight to have one of his gym suits altered to show sections of his back, arms, and legs, he'd given his quirk room to grow. When Present Mike abruptly announced that the exam was going to begin, almost everyone was taken aback, but soon enough, robots were being crushed left, right, and center. Even with the blonde's help, Izuku had trouble keeping up with most of the other hopefuls at first until finding his rhythm. Izuku made the most of his peculiarity even though it didn't give him much attacking power yet. By eliminating a robot that had wandered into his field of vision after getting thrown around by another boy's antics, he earned 2 points. With a rapid punch to an exposed panel and a quick plate extension, a vital cable was broken, sending the object falling into their make-believe city's concrete. Even so, he wasn't scoring very many points, and at just 6, he was beginning to become anxious because he knew that time was running out quickly. Izuku had excellent defense even though he wasn't a particularly strong offensive player, and despite his low score, he was compelled to jump. He witnessed punches and lasers directed towards exposed sides and vulnerable backs between some of the other hopefuls. He received no genuine gratitude from anyone, but at one point he believed he saw the boy with the motors in his legs and bespectacles giving him an odd look across an intersection. Next, the opponent known as 0 Point emerged. When Izuku saw the size of the object, he thought the diagram they had been shown was a little deceiving, even if they had been ordered to just ignore it. When the thing began toppling buildings, the majority of the applicants dispersed to the winds, and just as Izuku was about to disappear, he heard something that diverted his attention back to the enormous machine that was moving towards him. He felt a howl of pain, fury, and absolute dread resonate in his soul, and he pivoted to face the source of the sound. The 0 Point behemoth was rolling inexorably towards the brown-haired girl who had assisted him back before this whole thing started. She was fighting to extricate her ankle from behind some rubble. Izuku's body reacted, his legs driving him back into the line of fire, but his head was already in high gear. Kish was muttering something in the back of his mind, but the frantic swirling of his thoughts made it impossible for him to make sense of it. His gaze flickered back and forth in an attempt to find an answer. He got to her side as quickly as he could, so if his estimation was right, he would only have 2 minutes until the robot's tread ground them both to mush. He tugged at the debris anxiously. "Are you okay?" Her arms flailing at the stone that held her, she simply nodded. He exclaimed, "Your quirk," in the hopes that it would soothe her, and it appeared to accomplish just that. He sensed the charge of a laser, which he knew instinctively was directed at them both, more than he heard it. Maneuver 22 came to mind as he drew from the many months of scribbling in his notepad without looking back. His arms, legs, and back all had plates that protruded and grew nearly by themselves. Using as many of his plates as he could manage, Izuku constructed layers of overlapping shields, holding himself over the girl while she used the rubble's gravity to propel herself away. Izuku nearly lost consciousness due to the collision alone, and before she could react, he heard an electric discharge and intense pain burning over his back. He repressed a cry of misery. He was hardly able to stay upright, and his mind was having trouble getting back up. It felt like all of his muscles had forgotten how to move. The brown-haired girl said, "I've got you," and he felt his weight kind of melt away. At last, his muscles began to relax as the girl pulled them both away from the enormous robot. When his legs started to function again, he gave the girl a signal to return his weight, and they both reserved it for the area's entry. After squeezing past a barrage of bullets, they heard Present Mike issue a 3-minute warning. Now that his mind was fully functional, Izuku realized that something had to be done about the massive mecha tearing through the Mimic City, even though he was still not coherent enough to understand what Kish was trying to tell him. He motioned for the girl to approach a big metal rod that was lying in the road, and she grabbed hold of it. He drew out a strategy in his thoughts, using some crude physics to support the long, pointed end of the rod on the side of a chunk of stone debris in the road. He kept the girl and himself behind the low wall it formed, and then he looked around for the lad with the glasses and gestured for him to approach them. After a few attempts, he quickly made it over with a frightened glance back at the gates. "What's going on?" Izuku stated that he had a plan. The second boy attempted to talk sense into his head, saying, "There's no point, we won't get any credit for taking this thing down." Though the lad with the glasses gave him a look that suggested he thought he was crazy, Izuku shot back, "That doesn't matter," adding, "She's made this rod weightless, and if I'm right, you should be able to kick with enough force to launch it into that monster's head." Still apprehensive, it needed one more prod. "Just do it, please." The second youngster seemed torn for a minute, but with a grimace he skidded over to the back of the rod and revved the motors in his calves. Pulling back, he kicked the flat end of the rod at a high speed, sending the weightless missile hurtling towards the massive robot's brainbox. Izuku had indeed had accurate data. The kick had given the rod enough acceleration to drive it quickly enough to skewer the giant's skull like a cocktail olive, even though its weight had been neutralized. Moments then, Present Mike exclaimed, "Time's up." Izuku felt a wave of relief wash over him, and as he passed out, the last thing he heard was the other two applicants worrying about him. Izuku woke up in the school medical center. Every part of his body ached, and there were several missing plates on his arms and back. After being introduced to Recovery Girl, he briefly raved over her out of exhaustion before receiving a reprimand for his carelessness. After being given some energy-boosting candies and sent on his way, he soon started to feel a little down. 6 points. He hung his head, equally exhausted and ashamed. On the basis of his written exam results, he had a remote chance of being accepted into the hero program, so that hope was not very comforting. "Your exam result undoubtedly matters more than the little villain points you received." Kish attempted to console him, but once more his thoughts was racing, this time with worry. Izuku tried to take the comforting words seriously, but he was unable to. The big one wasn't worth anything. It was just some obstacle they put in to keep us on our toes. You heard Present Mike in the briefing. He didn't eat much throughout the week. He waited for his findings because of his anxiety. Naomi had done her best to lift his spirits, and he had tried his hardest to keep his worries to himself so that she wouldn't have to worry too. His mother was upbeat, although fretting over how many plates he'd lost. She thought over what had happened several times, but Izuku was too scared to tell her about the terrifying encounter. Even worse, Izuku had been hoping to gain some counsel from his gaunt friend, Yagi, who had not even been to the beach. By Friday, Izuku had barely been out of his room. Due to a holiday, he didn't have to go to school today, so he spent his time on his phone and had sporadic discussions with Kish. Until his mother's anxious excitement drew his attention from down the hall, he was certain he would not accomplish much throughout the day. For the first time since breakfast, he emerged from his room and saw his mother with quivering fingers and wide eyes while carrying a white envelope. She held it out to him and said, "Izuku, honey, I think these are your results." It had the UA crest on it. Izuku allowed her to drop it into his hands and he shakily stumbled back into his room. The envelope had an odd weight to it, leading him to believe that something other than paper was within. For more than a few minutes, he held it by its sides and stared at the white paper as if it would open and reveal its secrets on its own. Izuku, however, opened the packet at Kish's mental prodding and discovered a little electronic gadget within. He placed it carefully on his desk and almost leapt out of his chair as it suddenly came to life and started playing a crazy hologram of All Might. Young Midoriya Izuku. The number 1 hero's blustery voice cried. He was wearing a dark yellow suit with pinstripes, and he made excited gestures while he talked. Izuku perked up at the announcement. He had guessed he'd done well on the written component, but he hadn't even hoped to achieve full marks. Your performance on the written exam was exemplary and you were awarded full marks. All Might went on, however, and Izuku felt his stomach drop out of his mouth. It was right here. His terrible performance on the practical exam, which led to his rejection. The symbol seemed to be waiting for the inevitable letdown, and Izuku couldn't help but be perplexed by the solemn look on his face. He was beginning to believe that time had stopped to spite him, and the stress was getting too much for him to handle. Such excellence is to be expected from one of the most promising candidates from this year's practical, Izuku muttered. What? He had to tell his mother he was okay because his outburst was so loud. He turned to face All Might, who was grinning broadly at him in the dim light of his room. Though you were only able to score 6 villain points in your takedown of the combat droids, we are quite happy to report that you scored the highest number of rescue points in over a decade. Izuku had to fight to keep his eyes from rolling into the back of his head with sheer relief. While it was clearly explained in your briefing that the combat droids were the main focus of the exam, he turned, pointing a remote of some kind behind him to turn on a screen. He could make out 2 distinct boxes behind All Might, each lighting up with a different colored number. The number 80 was displayed in green, while the number 6 was displayed in yellow. All Might's smile became even broader and wider as he said, and to cap off your accomplishments, while the destruction of the combat mammoth was worth 0 villain points. We here at UA were simply stunned by the tactical aptitude you displayed in the act of smashing it. It's been a long time since we've seen such plus ultra effort. Might would have continued, but Izuku heard him remark on how many of these he needed to capture as a hand signaled a wrap-up from off-frame. Grinning, he turned back to face the camera. Hello, Midoriya Izuku. He called out to him from outside the hologram. Welcome to your Hero Academia. Izuku nearly gave his mother another heart attack as he bounded from his room into the living area before the hologram had completely faded. He couldn't help but cry, Mom, I passed. I got in, with excitement. That night, a lot of tears were shed at the Midoriya home. Before his high school career officially began, Izuku headed to Dagobah Beach to take one last look at its glittering shore. He'd been hoping to see something else as well, and as the sandy expanse came into view, he could just make out something, and when he realized it was a human, he burst into a run. Izuku came to a halt alongside Yagi, who was reclining in his usual spot at the railing. The emaciated man turned to face Izuku, and smiled, a smile that Izuku had missed in the aftermath of the exam. He looked up and down at Izuku before saying, Sorry I couldn't be around the last week or so. Had a devil of a time pulling myself away from work. Izuku grinned and said, Don't you just look pleased as punch. He knew the smile would hurt if it lingered for too long, but at the time, he didn't give it any concern. Unable to control himself, he was bouncing on the balls of his feet and exclaiming, Yagi I passed. The entire statement came out in a nearly frenzied rush. I was so worried that I didn't score high enough on the practical exam and I wish you'd been here to talk to, but then I got the letter and All Might himself gave me the news. I passed, and All Might said they were impressed with how I did in the practical. Izuku would have noticed the sly twinkle in Yagi's eyes at the information if he had been listening. He patted the youngster on the back and stretched one bony hand around to say, Well now, that is something indeed. Yagi's words just appeared to make Izuku feel more exaggerated, to the point where he was scared the youngster could burst like an overblown balloon. Sounds like you're on your way to being a hero to be proud of, my boy. Congratulations, said Yagi. However, the youngster inhaled deeply many times, which seemed to calm him down a little. His speech was now spoken slowly enough that his sentences did not run together. I had no idea what I was doing, and everything happened so fast, he remarked. He ran a hand through his unruly hair and took another big breath. There were so many people that I barely got any points from defeating the mock villains. But they also had points for rescuing other participants, which they never mentioned during the briefing at the start. I almost had a heart attack when they said I'd impressed them. With a fierce laugh that almost caused him to start coughing, Yagi waved him off. Yagi, I don't think I could have done it without your advice. So I was hoping to see you before school started again so I can thank you. My boy, I didn't do anything, he declared. Just blathered on about things like any old man. Izuku's expression turned grave at that point. I mean it, Yagi, he said, appearing to be trying to teach him some universal truth at that precise time. Izuku bent as deeply as he could without going to his knees, and the old skeleton reddened slightly at the show of respect. Without some of the guidance you gave me over the last year, I don't know that I would have done as well as I did. Please accept my gratitude for all your help. I'm truly thankful for it. Now, Yagi clumsily said. Taking hold of the young man's shoulder, he helped him to stand again. There's no need for that, I was just happy to have the company of such a delightful young man these last few months. You've made quite the impression on me, and I'm looking forward to spending time here in Mustafu. Anyway, Izuku anxiously scratched the back of his neck, beginning to feel embarrassed. I'm glad I got the chance to see you again. The schedule they sent us for UA looks pretty hectic and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get back to the beach too often once classes started up again. Izuku's cheeks flushed at that. Think nothing of it, young Midoriya. Just enjoy yourself and work diligently to become the splendid hero I know you can be. They said their goodbyes once more before Izuku left for his house. But after Izuku had left, Yagi turned to look out in another way. You see what I was saying, he continued, as if he were speaking incoherently. Certainly, was the response, but it was difficult for an outsider to tell where it was coming from. But Toshi, are you really sure that one so young is suitable? Not that I don't trust your judgment, but I do have my own concerns, you understand, the high-pitched, almost childlike voice spoke again. He turned to face the direction that Izuku had gone, saying, I'm more than aware of the risks involved. Yagi lowered his chin to rest atop his arms that he lay along the railing and said, but I definitely want to keep an eye on him. I know you have a few others in mind, but something about that young man gives me hope for this world, and I can't help but be drawn to him. The boy somehow reminds me of myself in a lot of ways. The tiny voice said, very well. The small voice seemed worried as it continued, I will admit his performance has me intrigued, and with all you've told me about him, I'm sure he has the potential. But Toshi, I wonder how much longer you'll be able to hold out. Your injury may be stable, but your continued hero work and the limit on how long you can simply hold up the facade is waning. Don't worry so much, I'll be able to make my decision soon, stated the man. But I wanted you to see firsthand what brought him to my attention. The boy just feels like it was made for him. The smaller voice carried a feeling of urgency, hinting at severe circumstances. Just don't make any rash decisions, Toshi. We only have so much time. And while it may be years before the other makes his move, it would be best if we started preparing someone soon. After that, Yagi said, I understand, and became quiet. I'll be heading back now, but don't stay out too long. Yagi just nodded. Izuku was shown a fascinating sight when he opened the door to Class 1A. He realized right away that Bakugo was back in his class, as fate would have it. He was fighting with the boy with the glasses from the entrance examinations. While most pupils were seated at their seats, he stood beside Bakugo and waved his arms excitedly and stiffly in relation to the desks and feet. Bakugo, for his part, was being just as hard and unforgiving as always. After hearing something about a stick and places the sun doesn't shine, Izuku stopped listening to him. His gaze went throughout the classroom. He knew he would be seated directly behind Bakugo because there were only 3 empty desks. Oh my goodness. At the rear of the first row stood one of the 2 vacant desks. He was thinking about who was going to sit there when he heard someone say, you. That's when he turned back to the tall lad with the spectacles. You were in my practical exam group. I must say, he remarked as he moved around the room, I'm impressed with your intuition on realizing there was more to the exam than they told us. I'm Iida Tenya. He heard Bakugo scoff from behind Iida, but all he did was raise an eyebrow. Just as he was going to inform the boy that, in reality, he was unaware of the exam's secondary component, he heard a different voice say, hey. And turned to see the girl with the brown hair from the exam standing just behind him. You're the shield boy from the exam, she said, getting much closer than he felt safe to. Though his connection with Naomi had given him some experience with girls, he had never been this close to a stranger. His face was rushing with heat, so he covered it with his arm. He started, shield boy, but she interrupted him with animated discussion. Iida snorted in disapproval at the nickname, so cool. The way you handled that big thing was amazing. Blocking its laser with your shield and then getting Glasses Boy to kick that huge spike into its face. Izuku was about to stutter out a reply, frantically trying to decide between, thank you, and, it was nothing, But he was interrupted again, this time by what he initially thought to be a giant yellow caterpillar. Enough of this drivel. After all three of them at the door gathered their composure, they discovered a very worn-looking face peeping out of a sleeping bag, drink pouch half dangling from his lips. Izuku paled at the man's words. If all you came here to do was socialize, you can find another school to attend. He was about to apologize when Kish and his newly functional brain informed him that his homeroom instructor was. He shouted, "Everyone down to the athletic field," getting to his feet and opening his sleeping bag to reveal that he was somewhat taller than Iida. With a worried expression, the round-faced girl questioned, "But what about the opening ceremony?" He wasn't exactly frowning, but he didn't seem to be in the best of moods either, Izuku thought. Such formalities are nonsense. Heroes don't have time for such frivolities. Without saying anything more, he turned and walked away. "You have 15 minutes to change into your gym clothes and meet me at the athletic field." After asking the class, was I the only one who studied the map? Iida led the others towards the changing rooms. Soon after, they were gathered in the slightly cool spring air at the edge of the athletic field, where the lines for the typical track and field exercises were marked. Standing there with a grim expression on his exhausted face was their homeroom instructor. Something about his clothes, a black shirt and slacks with what must have been the longest and thinnest scarf he had ever seen, struck Izuku as familiar. As he strained to place the individual in front of him, he began to talk. The man scratched his eye absently with a free hand. "Here at UA we pride ourselves in putting out well-trained and well-prepared hero candidates. To do that we have to know what we're working with." Iida's hand rocketed into the sky at this point. "I want to see what each of you can do, so we're going to have a physical apprehension test, but with a twist." He adjusted his glasses and remarked, "Shouldn't that information be on our school records from last year?" Without waiting for an answer, their homeroom teacher scratched his 5 o'clock shadow and said, "Surely those records were forwarded to UA during our enrollment. That's why I said we'll do it with a twist. You've never been allowed to use your quirks in tests like these before." His face seemed to light up with something that Izuku equated to nearly hatred. He drew out what appeared to be a baseball with sensors wrapped around it and said, "We need to know just what you are capable of to make sure you have what it takes to endure the rigorous nature of the curriculum." He hurled it at Bakugo. "Demonstrate." Bakugo unleashed an explosive throw that culminated in a loud cry of, "Die!" as he squared up and grinned widely. The homeroom teacher had a tablet that showed a figure of 705.2 meters. As Bakugo moved back into the crowd, he remarked, "This is what we're looking for." A look of malice filled his face. "As an extra rule of the test, the lowest scoring person will be expelled. If you have no potential, you have no business in this class," he said, his attitude initially mean before becoming blatantly cruel. Izuku heard someone ask, "Are you serious?" amid the students. Izuku's mind was racing over every scenario in the typical physical apprehension test as the class mumbled in shock and outrage, attempting to figure out how to turn his quirk to his advantage. Panic was beginning to set in, and not much was going right for him. Kish then added a comment from the back of his mind. "Izuku, try to unwind. Even though the armor plating might not be as useful as some of the other oddities on show, you can definitely find a use for it." His growing nervousness was easily subdued by Kish's steady, quiet voice. "You are in really good physical shape for your age because you have been training for a long time. You should have no trouble passing this test." Izuku took a deep breath to center himself while more people were invited to join in. He was capable of this. He received mediocre outcomes in a few of the events. His performances in the long-distance run and the 50-meter dash put him in the middle of the class. He performed exceptionally well on the sitting toe touch and sit-ups, and his grip strength was above average but not exceptional. However, his performance on the standing long jump and repeated side steps was subpar. His performance in the ball toss was nowhere near as good as Bakugo's, but the girl with the brown hair who never had a ball land was the true star of that test. They glanced at the data, and he felt the panic rising again in his chest. It appeared that he would be sent home since he had no exceptional performance in any of the categories. By now, the entire class was looking a little messy, with each student attempting to get their name up on the scoreboard. At the very bottom of the pile, there was Izuku's name. His eyes began to brim up with tears as the homeroom instructor spoke. He spent a few moments to review all of the data, and with every second that went by, Izuku was more and more overcome with anxious anguish. "Your results aren't bad for the quirks you're working with, and I'm more than satisfied," The statement caused the entire class to go silent. And nobody is going to be expelled. There were several yells of protest, but Izuku could only feel relief. That was just a rational deception to keep you from slacking off during the test. When he said, "My name is Aizawa Shota," something dawned on Izuku. Mr. Aizawa left after saying, "I'm your homeroom teacher for the year, get changed and go home. I expect you all to be on time for class tomorrow." The students then began making their way back to the changing areas. A loud cry came from behind them before they could go very far. "Hey Deku!" Izuku halted and pivoted, a worried expression spreading over his face. He hadn't heard Bakugo's voice in that kind of tone in years. Izuku turned to find Bakugo walking confidently towards him. "Even with your quirk you're still useless. I saw your scores, barely even average. I told you before you wouldn't hold a candle to me even if you managed to get into UA." A few other pupils were ogling each other. Izuku remained silent. His former friend continued to call him by the derogatory moniker throughout the years, even after he had gained his talents. Regardless of how much he tried to elevate himself, Bakugo was always there to bring him back down. Izuku's confidence had suffered at the hands of the much louder child, even if he was no longer the same shy and carefree boy he used to beat up all the time. Izuku was certain that under Kachan's sneering stare, he would have been a stuttering, unintelligible mess if not for Kish. Iida said, "I don't see how that's relevant," as the taller boy approached Bakugo from behind. Bakugo gave Iida a stinging gaze, which to his credit he experienced without flinching. He made it into the hero course, and that makes him just as worthy to attend this institution as any of us. Sucking in his teeth, Bakugo turned back to face Izuku. He simply swept past without saying anything more, giving Izuku a firm shoulder check in the process. Iida spoke with him on their walk back to the changing rooms. What was that about? He stopped himself and said, "Cash, Bakugo and I grew up together, and he's always been kind of on a high horse about his quirk." He bowed his head a little as they walked, but he forced a rehearsed smile onto his face. "I'm Midoriya Izuku, by the way. I didn't get the chance to introduce myself earlier." "Ah," Iida responded, "I suppose there would be people like him in all kinds of places." After changing, the two headed towards the school's entrance but stopped to look when they heard someone calling out to them. The voice grew more and more familiar. Deku. The girl with brown hair, whose ball had not returned from her throw. She paused to collect her breath and shot them a smile that made Izuku's chest tighten, but not in the same way as before. "Wait up. If you're going to the station I'll go with you." "Deku?" inquired Iida. "I thought your name was Izuku?" But that was what Bakugo called him before. The girl tilted her head in curiosity, right? "Oh," Izuku answered back. He schooled his features into a composed face, saying, "That's a nickname he's used for me since before I got my quirk. It's an alternate reading of one of the characters in my name. It means useless or helpless. My name is actually Midoriya Izuku." "Okay," the girl remarked, nodding to him. "My name's Uraraka Ochako, and you're Iida, right?" she stated, pointing. Uraraka struck a powerful pose by grasping her bicep and raising one arm in a strongman position. "But I think Deku is such a cool name, maybe for a hero, you know? It kinda sounds like the word for, 'you can do it,' in Japanese." Uraraka said. "It's even a little cute too, I like it." Her words raced through his mind, and something, other than worry or dread or any other emotion he could immediately identify, began to build up in his chest. In his mind, something clicked into place as though it had always been there but he had never noticed it. Before he could stop himself, he blurted, "Then you can call me Deku." A blush of embarrassment crossed his face, which he tried to cover up by turning aside. "But wait," Iida replied, "why would you let her call you that if it's an insult?" Izuku said, still attempting to conceal his blush, "I don't know. It just feels different when she says it. My understanding of the name has just been turned on its head." Before they had to part ways at the station, they joked around a little, sharing small bits of information about themselves and each other. Since Iida lived in Tokyo, he boarded a train that was going north. "My train is this way," Uraraka said, gesturing to the trains heading west. "Where are you going?" He pointed south and added, "Actually, I don't live that far away. My flat is a few kilometers from the beach so I don't need a train." Uraraka said, "Lucky." Izuku watched her walk away, joyously waving at him, and was at a loss for words. "I tried to get a flat closer to school, but I still have to take the train to the next town over. My parents live all the way in Mie, she exclaimed. After stumbling into a bus that would transport him most of the way home, Izuku placed his backpack in the unoccupied seat next to him. It had been such an emotional roller coaster today. Izuku found more people in his flat than simply his mother when he went inside when he got home and shut the door. He was shocked to see Naomi and his mother seated at the kitchen table. She said, "Hey Izu," as soon as she saw him. He had to take a moment to gather himself following her surprise arrival before asking, "How was your first day?" "It went well," he stated. He put his backpack in his room, went back to the kitchen and undid his uniform jacket before saying, "It got a little tense, and it wasn't anything like I expected, but things turned out for the better. Bakugo and I are in the same class again this year, and he's as aggressive as ever." Naomi merely grinned. "I suppose there are drawbacks to everything," she replied. Izuku was aware that her interactions with Bakugo had given her insight into the situation. Izuku smiled to himself and nodded. "But you made some friends too, right?" He took a chair at the table and sat down, observing his mother's rapt attention. "Sure I did. 2 of the people from my exam are in my class, and they seem like really nice people." The malicious expression in his friend's eyes vanished happily as Izuku replied, "Cool, Izu. What are their names?" As he was ready to continue, he noticed his mother's smile widening and Naomi's sly expression. "Iida Tenya, and Uraraka Ochako." Naomi continued, teasingly putting her palm to her mouth in a pretend scandalized manner, asking, "Oh, what's this? I'm not the only girl in your life anymore, Izu. What does this mean for our poor friendship?" Right away, Izuku began to stammer as he tried to clarify that they had just recently met and that nothing stood between them. For the most part, Naomi stopped teasing and laughed instead. Izuku talked with his mother and friend till dinnertime. He had been informed by Naomi that she and Taro had been accepted to the same general education high school. Even though he was confident she would make lots of friends at school, Izuku was relieved to hear that she wouldn't be lonely. Just before he and his mother were to have dinner, Naomi left. Izuku almost dropped his rice bowl in shock at the words, "It's a shame the 2 of you never got together." He'd never disclosed to his mother their peculiar love triangle predicament or his crush on Naomi. "She's such a nice girl and you've known each other for ages." Izuku complained, "Mom." His mother chuckled and continued talking about other things, including how his father was able to take time off for several holidays this year in addition to celebrating Izuku's birthday every year. "He's lobbying for a vacation this year, and I think he deserves it after all the hard work he's done for that company." It was a pleasant evening, and Izuku chose to go to bed a bit earlier than usual since he wanted to arrive at class on time. As Izuku and his classmates settled into life at UA High, the grueling and hectic nature of the course became all the more apparent to them all. They rarely had free time during classes, and their homeroom teacher, who Izuku had figured out was the pro hero, Eraserhead, had not been bluffing about how rigorous the curriculum was. In addition to all of the normal subjects that high school students needed like English and science, they also had classes like heroics and tactical planning. Keeping up with all the classwork and training was almost more than some of them could handle. That said, they did have the occasional moment of peace on campus. Lunchtime was nearly always a bright spot in any day, barring the incident where reporters had snuck onto campus somehow. Iida had cemented himself as deserving of being class representative that day, despite how their voting had turned out. Izuku still wasn't sure how he had gotten 3 votes. Every now and again something would come up for the teachers, resulting in a free period. During one such free period, due to All Might hurriedly running off to take care of some urgent business, students began gathering into makeshift groups. Bakugo took off to do his own thing, and a few of his classmates seemed to gather around Ashido Mina's desk. Tokiyami and Todoroki both seemed to be content in their own company, and Mineta was bothering Asui and Yaoyorozu, making lewd insinuations. To Izuku's surprise, he found that both Iida and Uraraka gravitated toward his desk. "So what do you think All Might's urgent business is?" Uraraka sat at Bakugo's desk and was leaning forward eagerly. She seemed to have no problem invading other people's space, and Izuku was trying his best to not let on that it made him uncomfortable. He ran out of here so quickly, it must be really important. "Yeah," Izuku replied lamely. "I've got no idea what All Might could be up to." Iida shook his head. "I'm sure whatever it is," he said, "he'll have it taken care of soon. I just hope his business doesn't interrupt classes too much." It would be unbecoming of a professional like himself if his teaching suffered due to something trivial. He was sorting through some of his papers for another class. But seriously. Uraraka bounced in her seat. It's so interesting. What could possibly cause the number one hero to dash off like that in the middle of class? Izuku wasn't sure. All Might's behavior had been odd since classes had begun. He showed up for class at the last minute, dashed off as soon as the bell rang at the end, and it was almost impossible to find him unless he was teaching or supervising students. Then there were times like today that he'd abruptly leave class in the middle of the day and not be seen again till the next day. Class 1A had modern heroics in the afternoon, and Izuku thought that might have something to do with it due to the patterns. But without more evidence he couldn't really put together a theory. I just hope everything is all right with him. Izuku let out a worried sigh. All Might has never been the most normal hero, but I suspect that being the symbol of peace would make being normal a bit difficult. Both Uraraka and Iida nodded in agreement. Still, Iida made a sweeping gesture. Things here at UA are a bit more unorthodox than I was expecting. He put the pen he was using down on the desk, and turned to more fully face his friends. First the apprehension test that Mr. Aizawa gave us, and all this strange behavior from All Might. It's certainly different from middle school, that's for sure. Izuku grabbed his chin with his hand and his brow furrowed in concentration. The entrance exam notwithstanding, all the teachers have personalities that seem strange for being teachers. I know they're all pro heroes and that kind of work comes with its own difficulties and it may just be their coping mechanisms that created or enhanced the kinds of behaviors they fell into, but it shouldn't have this much of an impact on their teaching. Izuku was off on another muttering episode and it took a few minutes for anything to get through to him. Midoriya. Iida was waving a hand in front of his face when he finally looked up. I thought we'd lost you for a moment there. Oh, Izuku said, sorry. It's a habit. Still, his interest had been piqued. It was a question that would continue to float around his head for some time to come. I'll be right back. He stood from his desk, gotta hit the restroom. Once done in the restroom, he was about to return to class when he caught sight of something rounding a corner. Curiosity getting the better of him, he walked over to the corner and peered around it. There was nothing down the hallway and he was about to turn back towards class when he heard something from a nearby unused classroom. You've got to be more careful. It sounded like the principal, and Nezu's voice was nearly unmistakable. You can't be going overboard and having your time run out halfway through the day. In response, a familiar voice spoke up. I know, but I couldn't help it. Izuku was shocked to hear the voice of Yagi, the stranger from the beach he befriended last year. It was just one incident after another. I couldn't just let them be. Stunned, he almost missed what was said next. I understand that you have a passion for the hero business that has surpassed all of your colleagues, the principal was saying. But keep in mind your condition. You already have a hard time with the schedule here, and there are plenty of heroes here in Mustafa that can take care of things. There was hints of both frustration and concern in the little mouse man's tone. Try to let them bear some of the burden if you can. I'll try, Yagi's voice returned. But there are times when my body reacts before I even notice. An admirable trait for a hero, and it has served you well these many years. It is perhaps the backbone of your success, Nezu replied. But right now you need to tone it down until we find a suitable candidate. We've narrowed it down significantly, but you're still on the fence about the decision. I know, Yagi said. They're all great kids. The one Night Eye suggested is quite promising, but he trailed off here. You're still hung up on that first year, aren't you? There were some non-committal noises made and the principal continued. If that is the decision you make, I won't argue with you, he said. But remember Toshi, Nezu's tone was grave, you need to make sure it's the right decision. You saw him during the entrance exam, there was a spark of fire in the older man's voice. Izuku could almost see it burning in his deep-set blue eyes. His drive to help others was on full display, and pulling off that kind of tactical maneuver isn't something just anyone can do. All right Toshi, the principal said. Let's just get you back to the office. You can rest up there and be ready for your last class. You need to finish out the day at least. There was the scraping of a chair and footsteps were heading in Izuku's direction. Not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, he quietly made his way back to the classroom. The questions were swimming in his head. Why was Yagi at UA? What class did he teach? What kind of candidate was he looking for? Night Eye, All Might's former sidekick, had recommended one? It was all so confusing. Calm down, Izuku. Kisha's voice cut through the swirling thoughts and he nearly flinched. It will do you no good to endlessly speculate. You don't have nearly enough information. You're right, Izuku replied. I can't possibly make an accurate guess at this point. You also need to consider that the conversation you overheard was not one meant for your ears. Izuku did flinch at the disappointment in Kisha's tone. Whatever those two were discussing has nothing to do with you. I supposed that's true. Sorry, Kish. There was a sense that he was forgiven, which made him feel a bit better. But why wouldn't Yagi tell me that he was working at UA? Did he not trust me? His reasons are his own. You must just respect that it was his decision not to inform you, and that it was not made in any attempt to hurt you. Izuku nodded and fell silent. He eventually made it back to class, just a few minutes before the next lesson was due to start. The next time All Might's class came around, Izuku would have much more pressing matters to think about. Izuku stood face to face with his childhood friend across a stretch of hallway inside the building where the mock battles were taking place. Both boys were breathing heavily, and each had a myriad of scratches and bruises across their bodies. Izuku's hero costume had been nearly shredded, and Bakugo's was only faring so much better. Izuku could not have seen this coming when All Might had slid into the classroom earlier that day, nor could he have predicted just how personal this battle had become. As he reflected on the day, both he and Bakugo began moving toward each other, quirks activating and battle cries on their lips. It had been one hell of a day, and Izuku was sure it would be more hell before it ended. Moments later his vision was partially obscured by a blinding flash of light and his thoughts shifted to what was going on at that precise moment in time. He didn't have time to think about the past. All Might flung open the door to Class 1A and made a dramatic entrance befitting the number 1 hero. I am here, he said, stopping in the front of the room in a heroic pose. And we are going to the training ground for a practical lesson, so gather your costumes and meet me at training ground beta. The whole class had been excited at the prospect. It had been almost 2 weeks since classes had started, and their hero costumes had been sitting in their cases since they had arrived. Training ground beta was a mock city, much like the one Izuku's practical exam had been in. It looked nearly untouched, with nary a brick out of place, and he was impressed. While they waited for All Might to arrive for the lesson, some of the students were comparing costumes. Some of the costumes were elaborate, like Ida's that looked like a suit of armor or Bakugo's huge gauntlets. Others were a bit more revealing, like Uraraka's bodysuit or Yaoyorozu's split leotard. Then there were the ones that left little to the imagination, such as Kirishima's shorts and shoulder rings look. Izuku couldn't really say much, because his costume didn't cover much more. His costume had been put together by his mother as a special gift for getting into UA. It looked quite a bit different from the designs he'd made all those years ago before getting his abilities from Kish. Large swaths of fabric had to be cut out to give his plates room to expand, leaving the back of his legs and arms mostly bare, as well as his back. His chest was covered in studded leather plates while his thighs and shins had guards over them, and the whole thing was held on by strips of cloth around his shoulders and the small of his back. He had a hooded cowl upon his head with what looked like bunny ears which left his nose and mouth uncovered. His costume was split between teal and green colors that complemented his armor plates and his hair color. Altogether I think it came out well, Kish commented on the aesthetic. Despite the concessions that needed to be made for your abilities, it looks remarkably like your old design. Izuku mostly agreed. I could probably refine the design a bit, but I didn't want to upset Mom, he replied. She put so much effort into making it, I just can't bring myself to make any changes. Uraraka had lamented that her costume had ended up so tight-fitting, and Izuku had needed to suppress certain urges at the sight of it. But there wasn't too much time to respond before All Might showed up and explained the scenario. They would be having a mock battle consisting of 2 teams of 2 people. One team would play the heroes, and one would play the villains. After being split up into teams, where Izuku was paired with Uraraka, lots were drawn to determine the matchups. The first picks were A, for the heroes, himself and Uraraka, and D, for the villains, Iida and Bakugo. Izuku groaned, massaging his face with one hand. What's wrong, Deku? Uraraka seemed concerned. Izuku looked up at her and sighed. It would have to be Bakugo. His tone was bordering on defeatist. The universe seems to enjoy putting us in these positions. He's going to try and murder me, I just know it. Come on, Deku, Uraraka said. If things get out of hand, I'm sure All Might will stop the exercise." The smile she gave him made his heart flutter, and he still couldn't figure out why she had that effect on him. "Let's do our best and win this." She was so cheerful, and Izuku felt his spirits rising in spite of himself. They spent the last few minutes before the start of the exercise studying the layout of the building and strategizing several ways to reach the fake bomb that was their target. Izuku was running through ways to deal with Bakugo when the buzzer sounded, signaling them to begin. They entered the building and began climbing floors, being careful to check around each corner before advancing. They made it up 3 floors before their progress came to a screeching halt. There, standing at the end of the main hallway, was Bakugo. Sparks were already flaring in his hands and there was a wicked smirk on his face. When he caught sight of them, he started yelling, "Deku! Get out here so I can put you in your place." There was almost a manic quality to his speech, like his eagerness to hurt his former friend was overwhelming him. Izuku waved at Uraraka to move back. He nodded his head in another direction and she nodded back. They had discussed what to do in a situation like this while they had climbed the stairs. Their course of action confirmed. Izuku stepped out around the corner with more confidence than he felt, and Uraraka sprinted across the way and around to the back of the building via an adjacent corridor. She was going to head for the top, or she had been. But she hesitated and stood just around that corner, thinking she might help if things got out of hand. Without the knowledge of the other students, she would bear witness to years of pent-up emotions. "What is your problem, Kachan?" Izuku asked. Both boys knew the question had a deeper meaning, and Bakugo answered it without delay. "My problem?" His voice was filled with contempt. "I don't have a problem, you do." Tiny explosions were popping in his hands and the look on his face spoke of pure rage. "You were supposed to be a tiny bug for me to crush on my way to greatness. It was determined when we were kids that I was the main character, and you were just an extra." Midoriya wanted to say something, but he found no place to interject as the other boy continued. "No matter how many times I beat you down, you never stopped getting back up." His eye twitched and the glare he fixed on Izuku would have likely cowed him years ago. "You were quirkless for 3 years, and then out of nowhere you go and get a quirk just to mock me." Izuku had no time to reply as Bakugo lunged at him. With barely any time to spare, his plates sprung up into a makeshift buckler shield. First his left arm and then his right were busy keeping the explosions from getting into close enough range to deal real damage. "I have the most amazing quirk." Bakugo's rage had always been a thing to behold, but he was in rare form. Izuku tried to dodge around one of the other boys' attacks and took a blast to his side before hopping back a few steps to put some space between them. "Your quirk is nothing but background filler, and you should have stayed there." "That's not how life works, Kachan," Izuku yelled back, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Just because you have an amazing quirk doesn't mean you're the only one that matters." He had to dodge again with only seconds to spare as an exploding palm nearly slammed into his face, and there was a slight ringing in his ears as he felt part of his hood tear away. "It's not enough for you to mock me with your existence." The sentence came out in puffs, a word with each swing punctuated with a blast. "But you've always looked down on me. Offering your help and your friendship as if someone as amazing as I am needed it." Izuku threw his arms up in front of him, creating a larger shield out of the smaller two just in time to catch the worst of a large explosion. He could feel a couple of his plates crack under the force, and knew it would take days for them to regrow once molted. Izuku lowered his shields for a moment, and as if in slow motion he saw the wind-up to one of Bakugo's leading right hooks. With nothing more than a thought, he danced under it and grabbed the incoming arm and hauled it over his shoulder, taking its owner with it. Bakugo hit the floor with a resounding thump and the wind rushed out of him. Izuku knew he'd only have a few moments before his rival was back on his feet. He backpedaled several steps and choked back tears he knew were welling up at that very moment. "I never thought of you that way." The words came without hesitation, without thought or pretext. "All I wanted was for us to be friends, and to become heroes together. I thought we would stand back to back and save everyone together." He could see Bakugo's shoulders twitch as he moved into a crouched position, and he was still barely ready. "Top players don't need friends," Bakugo roared and pushed off the ground with a burst from his hands. He closed the space between them in almost the blink of an eye. Especially not a useless, defenseless, Deku. The blow might have taken his head off if he hadn't reacted on impulse. Izuku dove under the flying leap and twisted into an upward punch that landed in Bakugo's side. He heard him cry out, but it only seemed to be in more anger. Izuku knew his one-time friend was fast, and it was taking all of his concentration to not be battered to bits by all the strikes aimed at him. As it was, he could feel plates chipping away with each blast hurled at him. Caught up in the heat of the moment, he had no idea how his next words would affect everyone who was listening. Deku doesn't mean useless to me anymore. The words roared from his throat with emotion just as primal as the rage of his opponent. It means something more, and I'll make it the name of a hero. His arm swung up just as Bakugo was coming in for another strike, and while he managed to dodge that one with ease, even the brilliantly talented Katsuki couldn't avoid the follow-up of several extended plates ramming into him, spreading the pain across the whole of his right hip. Then the chase was on. The blow was enough to give Izuku an opening, and he took off in the opposite direction he knew Uraraka had gone, although he couldn't have known that she was running at the same time he was, having not been able to move during the entire exchange. He ducked in and out of rooms and corridors in a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Unfortunately, his stamina was wearing down, and it was only a matter of time before he ran out of steam. All the while he knew that Bakugo was getting stronger. While the boys were not too unevenly matched in speed and stamina, Bakugo had a slight lead in both. Unbalancing the scales even more was one of the explosion quirk's minor details. The more Bakugo moved around, the more of his explosive sweat would build up, and more ammo was something the boy knew how to take advantage of. Izuku had been grazed more than a few times during their chase, and the adrenaline did little now to ease his pain, but he would not yield. As he dodged another headlong lunge, he pulled off one of his damaged plates, with a heavy wince at the pain, and tossed it to divert the attention of his attacker. While his body and his reflexes had been keeping him just moments away from being fried on a platter, his mind had been ticking away looking for a way to turn this all around. I hope you don't think these gauntlets are just for show. There was a rare moment of tense calm. Ever the one to brag about his greatness, Bakugo was taunting Izuku. I had them designed to store my sweat as a neat little surprise for villains. They should be nice and full now. Izuku's mind kicked into a higher gear and then almost froze with the next words that formed on Bakugo's lips. Let's see how many walls I can punch through with one shot. Izuku only barely heard the scrape of the pin being pulled from its place before he was moving, and just in time to see the door frame he'd been hiding behind simply disappear in a flash of light and smoke. His heart was pounding in his chest as he scrambled for a new hiding place, and he could hear another outburst from Bakugo. Shut up! He chanced to look back into the hole that had formed and saw him pull the earwig from his ear and stomp on it. All Might must have been trying to calm him down, and Izuku knew from experience that it was a fool's errand. Calm was not something Bakugo did willingly or easily. Even as he scrambled up a flight of stairs, heading to floor 5 of 6, the seeds of an idea had been planted in Izuku's mind. That seed blossomed when he got word from Uraraka that she had found the bomb. I'm sorry, she said, I made it to the top floor, but Iida found me out. What are we going to do? That's quite the risky plan, Izuku. Kisha's voice drifted into his consciousness for the first time since the battle had begun. You'd be putting yourself and your teammate in serious danger if this wasn't just an exercise. I know, he replied, but I don't think I have any other choice. There's no way I can beat him in a straight U fight, and I don't have to if I can win us the match this way. Kish elected not to reply back, but Izuku could feel a hint of pride amid all the worry from his mentor. Uraraka, he said into his calm, I have a plan. His reflexes and his mind were working on equal speeds now. Where are you located? A quick back and forth confirmed his suspicions, and he relayed his plan to his partner. There was an eager, if worried noise of agreement from the other end. Just be careful, Deku. He didn't reply, and in his adrenaline-filled rush he missed the genuine care in her tone. Right, he whispered to himself. Let's do this. His movements began to have purpose. Instead of blindly ducking for cover, now he was playing the cat and mouse game for his own reward. He led Bakugo around corners and down hallways with a sense of purpose, and he made every move line up with his plan. Izuku took several more glancing blows for his trouble, and his breathing was becoming ragged the longer it went on, but he was secure in the knowledge that he would hold up just long enough to finish this whole thing. Finally moving into place, he knew that there was a standoff happening right above him. He skidded to a halt and turned to finally stand his ground, knowing that Bakugo wouldn't pass up the chance to finish him off in spectacular fashion. While they had not spent much time together in the last 7 or so years, Izuku knew his rival well enough to know how to get his attention. It went hand in hand with the knowledge of how to avoid it. Finally decided to take your beating like a man, huh? Izuku stood there without reply, watching through the tattered remains of his hood for the proper time to act. His assailant stalked closer, and his arm raised into a firing position. The pin almost sparkled in the light from the windows behind where he stood. Izuku said nothing and did not move until one gloved finger slid into the eye of the pin. At that moment everything shifted into slow motion for Izuku. The manic glee in Bakugo's eyes shone brightly for a moment, before he could register what his prey was doing. Izuku lunged forward, right at the flashpoint, and dropped into a slide, thrusting his leg into the air above him. The pin had already slid out of place by the time his foot came up to meet the bottom of the gauntlet. Izuku's eyes were screwed shut to avoid the flash of the explosion, but he felt even more than he heard the blast that rocked the building. The force of the explosion hammered his back into the floor, pushing the breath from his lungs. He prayed that this would work, and he could hear Uraraka shout something from above him, though the ringing in his ears would not let him make out what it was. Moments later, it was over, but Izuku lost consciousness before he could learn the outcome of the match. 2 hours later, Izuku awoke in one of the beds in the school infirmary. Bleary-eyed he looked around, not recognizing where he was for a moment, and his muscles tensed ready to respond to any attack. But when he relaxed, realizing that there was no danger, his body screamed at him in soreness. Now, came an elderly voice from nearby. Looking over, Izuku found Recovery Girl watching him with a dubious expression on her wrinkled face. You and that Bakugo certainly ran each other ragged, but it looks like you came out the worse for it. She motioned for him to relax and tapped her cane on the polished floor. I do hope you won't be a regular patient of mine, though I'm starting to think that's a foregone conclusion. Izuku would have laughed in relief if he wasn't so tired and sore. Recovery Girl shook her head and motioned to someone over her shoulder, and Izuku saw two figures approach from near the entrance to the room. Uraraka and Iida walked into his sight, dressed in their school uniforms. Both looked somewhat worried, but smiles found their way onto both faces when they realized he wasn't seriously injured. He was informed of the results of the match by Uraraka. We won the match, but Yaoyorozu kinda picked apart the whole battle, and it didn't feel like much of a victory after that. There was a chagrined tint to her tone, but it wasn't there long as she pumped her fist in the air. But we won. That's gotta count for something, right? Yes, Iida joined in. While I was quite impressed with what we saw on the viewing screens, I do share in Yaoyorozu's opinion that both you and Bakugo acted in rash and risky ways. He made a robotic chopping motion with his hand as he spoke. Bakugo didn't really seem to take the criticism of our classmate or the reprimand he got from All Might very well, and his reaction was not what I expected. I'm not sure I can blame him, Uraraka said. After what they said, and seeing how amazing the others were in their matches, I was kinda speechless too. Her balled-up fists waved energetically up and down in front of her. It was like, after you and Bakugo went so hard during your match, nobody wanted to hold back. They were so great. Oh, Izuku smiled wearily. You'll have to tell me all about the other matches. I hope I can see the review footage sometime. I'm sure that will be possible, Iida said. We'll just have to ask Mr. Aizawa or All Might about it later. Then he rested his chin between his thumb and index finger. Maybe you can tell us what you and Bakugo were talking about during your match. It seemed quite intense from what we could see. In his tired state, Izuku didn't notice the look of shame on Uraraka's face as she turned away from her friends. It wasn't that important. Izuku felt bad about lying to his friends, but he wasn't sure he was ready to share something so personal and emotional with them just yet. Just Bakugo trash talking like usual. Iida nodded and moved on to some of the other matches, and once he felt strong enough to sit up, they gave him his homework from the other classes he missed. They chatted like that until it was time to leave, and once Izuku got changed into his uniform again, he left for home. Recovery Girl gave him a few of her gummies to restore his energy, and told him not to make a habit out of ending up in her care. You're a nice boy, but I'd rather not see you more often than necessary, she said. Izuku crossed paths with Bakugo on his way out, and there was an instant where he thought he would blurt out all of his secrets on the spot, but the moment was broken when All Might appeared and tried to talk to the surly youth about something. Even he seemed nonplussed when Bakugo just brushed him off with a subdued oath. Izuku didn't stick around much longer, lest he too be lectured by his hero. It had been such a long day, and Izuku was ready to go home and sleep off the physical and emotional fatigue that had resulted from the recent events. Uraraka Ochako was an average girl, at least as close as one could get in the superhuman society that humanity had grown into. She aspired to greatness, not because of some grand sense of justice or ambition like her friends, but simply to ease her parents' burdens. Her parents had sacrificed greatly to ensure she had a good life, and she wanted so badly to repay them that she aspired to the greatness of the title, hero. Just to make their lives more comfortable, she would push herself to the limits of her abilities. She hadn't yet told Deku or Iida about her goals, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment at the thought. She was sure that they had much better reasons for becoming heroes than money. But the fact remained that, as she sat in her tiny economy apartment diligently scratching away at her homework with her pencil, that she was just as determined as any of them to reach her goals. Her quirk was not flashy, like Bakugo's, it wasn't evenly balanced like Suyu's, and it wasn't even something that she could really fight with like Iida or Deku's quirk. She absently stared at the little round pads on her fingers. Ochako put her pencil down at the thought of Deku's battle earlier that day. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop on her classmates, only wanting to help if she could. It felt like she had intruded on something private that was never meant for her ears. Guilt and shame washed over her, and she felt herself reaching for her out-of-date flip phone. She, Iida and Deku had exchanged phone numbers earlier in the week, and her hand rested on the device for a moment before she pulled it away. There was no way she could call or text him now. What would he think if he knew? Her thoughts escaped her mouth for a moment. Deku had brushed off the intense argument he'd had during their match as trash talk. Did that mean he didn't want anyone to know? Standing hurriedly from her chair, she threw herself onto her bed and grabbed the pillow in her arms and rolled from side to side. I can't tell him that I listened to all of that. He'd probably hate me. There was a stinging behind her eyes that she fought to hold back. But deep down she wanted desperately to talk to him about it. The raw emotions pouring out from both of the boys had been so intense that she'd barely been able to breathe as they yelled and fought. Then there were some of the things that had been said. Deku's quirk had manifested late, 3 years late, and she'd never heard of that happening. Was it really possible? She knew that quirkless people had a hard time of it, constantly surrounded by people with amazing abilities. How hard had it been on Deku to not have a quirk for so long? Bakugo had all but openly admitted to bullying someone who had thought of him as a friend. She didn't really hate Bakugo, but his entire attitude rubbed her the wrong way, as it did much of the class. Only a few people really tried to be friends with him, like Kirishima or Ishido, but he didn't seem to want to get to know anyone. To think that he'd gone so far as to use such a powerful ability to hurt someone as kind as Deku seemed unthinkable to her. It was clear that Izuku had only wanted to be Bakugo's friend. His words had reached deep into her soul and there was no mistaking the feelings contained in them. Then there were the feelings that had been directed, even if only tangentially at her. She knew because he had told them that Deku had been an insult. She had no real way to know just how horrible it had been, but to hear that she had changed the meaning of that name for him, she felt a tightness in her chest that confused her when she thought about it. When she'd heard him refute Bakugo's claim that he was useless, the sheer determination and force behind the proclamation had shaken her beyond what she'd like to admit. I had no idea. She pressed her face into the pillow and let out a scream of frustration and other unlabeled emotions. The stinging in her eyes came back as she thought about how the world had treated her friend in his childhood. Before she could fully suppress them, a few traitorous tears escaped. Ochako knew that all of this would continue to bug her for a long time to come. Mustering all of her resolve, she pushed herself off the bed and grabbed an opened package of mochi from her kitchen counter, rubbing at her face with one arm. The cheap snacks were a favorite of hers and right then she needed some comfort. She had come to UA for one reason only, to become a hero, but so many things had happened after only a couple of weeks since the entrance exams and she was still so far from her goal. She seriously envied the drive that Deku seemed to have in spades. Even with the terrible history he'd suffered, he still kept pushing into the future. Ochako shook her head and popped another mochi into her mouth. She would deal with everything when the time came. She crushed up the plastic packaging with a determined growl and tossed it into the trash with a huff. She picked up her pencil and attacked her homework once again. First she would do homework, then she would work out a bit before heading to bed, and she would face tomorrow head-on. Just like Deku, Bakugo Katsuki was unusually quiet. He knew it had scared his mother a little bit, because he was never truly quiet. She had asked him what was wrong, expecting the usual outburst and aggressive posture that had almost always been part of his demeanor. He knew that he had worried her, but he just didn't have the energy to engage with the old hag. Instead of their usual ritual of mock fighting, he had just sulked into his room and slammed the door, something that would usually earn a scolding and a lecture. The fact that his mother said nothing about it was telling of how much his uncharacteristic behavior had spooked her. He could count on one hand the number of times he'd caused her that kind of worry, but he couldn't bring himself to focus on such a thing. It felt like his entire world was crashing down around him. All of his life, he'd been told he was special. Katsuki could do anything because he was amazing and had an amazing quirk that everyone had marveled at it. Nobody else he'd ever met had a quirk as powerful as his. The only person as amazing as Katsuki was All Might. The number one hero and symbol of peace was the only person that could compare to him. Katsuki would become the number one hero, and he would be the best hero in the world. He would be the hero that no villain could beat, and no other hero could surpass, just like the man he idolized. That man was finally someone he could meet, and he'd been just as amazing as Katsuki had always imagined him to be. That man had reprimanded him for reckless behavior and had agreed with that witch in the bikini about his performance in the match. The match that he'd lost to Deku. Somehow, the anger slipped away from him as he scribbled automatically at the papers on his desk, pointless homework that didn't really mean anything. No matter how much he grasped at the anger, it simply fell through his fingers like so much sand. The bikini witch had won her match. So had the icy punk. The two students who were so good that they hadn't even had to take the entrance exam to get into the school. Just finding out that you could get in by recommendation had stung in a way that was alien to him. He was the best, and he thought no one could take that away from him. Bakugo slammed his fists down onto the desk, just barely remembering not to use his quirk and destroy his homework in the process. Again, the momentary flare of anger seemed to slip away from him like some kind of eel that he couldn't keep a hold of. The anger and pride that normally fueled him in all of his endeavors wouldn't come to him. Unbidden, the memories were summoned back to him. All the times that quirkless Deku had looked up to him, had fawned over him like everyone else. He'd gotten the best quirk, had the best grades, and everyone had been telling him all his life he would be great. But Midoriya Izuku still offered him help. Help from the weakest of the weak. How much had Deku looked down on him to offer his useless help to his better classmate? Quirkless Deku had decided on his own that they were friends. Just because their mothers knew each other and they were in the same classes at school, he decided that someone as weak and defenseless as him was worthy of Katsuki's friendship. As if friends were something he needed or wanted. Quirkless, useless, defenseless Deku had the gall to stand up to him when he was doing what the world had told him was his right to do. Useless, defenseless Deku had gotten a quirk 3 years later just to mock and undermine his greatness. Useless Deku had gotten into UA just to spite him after all this time, plotting and planning to take his glory away. Deku had beaten him, and he'd barely used his lame, weak, late quirk to do it. Bakugo Katsuki had eaten silently as his parents exchanged worried glances, and showered with no real enthusiasm. He slumped into his bed, having gone through his evening routine like a soulless zombie. His entire world was in shambles, and finally the anger was coming back to him. As he lay in bed just about dozing off, a fire lit in his chest. If the world was going to try to take his worth away from him, he'd just have to claw and fight to take it back. The world that told Katsuki that he was the beast seemed to have forgotten all of its praise, and he was just going to have to remind it that there was no going back on his ambitions. If the flames in his eyes had been real, his room would have been lit like a bonfire by its intensity. Yagi Toshinori, the hero the world knew as All Might, stood once again at Dagoba Beach. It had become a place of comfort for him since he'd come to Mustafa on his mission. It was where he had first met Midoriya Izuku, and watched the young man work hard to achieve his dreams. He remembered all the times he had talked to his young friend, now pupil. The parallels were undeniable. Sure, the boy was different in many ways to the young man that Yagi used to be, but in all the ways that mattered it was like the universe was holding up a mirror in front of him. His mission weighed heavily on his mind even then. Find a successor for One for All, a worthy and suitable vessel to carry on the legacy of his master before him. There were so many promising students at UA, as he had known there would be. His old alma mater was good at finding and molding the finest candidates into exemplary heroes. Nezu had brought him many profiles, and he had observed many of the students himself as their teacher. Tagada Mirio was especially promising, just as his former protege had insisted. The young man was neither lacking in morals or drive, he had all the markings of a true hero. If Yagi had met him just a little sooner, he might have become the new vessel for that power already. But before he had even started teaching at UA, Yagi had run into an earnest and kind young man who had taken it upon himself to rid a beautiful beach of a mountainous eyesore of trash that had covered it. He had gotten to know a young man with a noble soul, and a passion for heroism that had struck him just so. The many times he'd simply chatted away with the boy, offering guidance that he'd taken gratefully from an old man he didn't know, had endeared to him someone that seemed so right for the job. If young Midoriya had interested him before, his performance at the UA entrance exam had brought that interest into sharp focus. Even more so than his handling of the zero-point combat droid, Yagi had been struck by his willingness to do for others, even as he could tell the young man was panicking over his low score. The way he had acted, with almost no thought, to shield others from danger spoke to his weary old soul. His immediate charge back to help out young Uraraka in the face of something like the zero-point monstrosity, even though there was no obvious benefit to himself, had struck a chord in him. Nana, he spoke the name with almost a reverence mixed with so much regret, I think you would have liked young Midoriya. He laid his arms on the railing, just as he had done the first time he'd stared out at the beach. After the mock battles today, he was reminded just how young and impressionable the children in his care were. He had heard everything the boys had said during their match. His heart went out to Bakugo, and he knew that society had set him up to fail without even knowing it. The entirety of his life had been predicated on winning the genetic lottery. He was the strongest out of all the people he'd known growing up. It had to be hard on the young man to have all of his illusions shattered in so short a time. Yagi would have to ensure that young Bakugo was guided in the right direction, but while Bakugo was promising in many ways, he had a long way to go in becoming an exemplary hero. His combat prowess was unmistakable, and Yagi had known few that could adapt on the battlefield like the young firecracker. But all that combat skill would mean nothing if he couldn't see beyond the battlefield to the true core of what it meant to be a hero. Young Midoriya was very close to understanding the meaning of what a true hero was. He had the heart, and the drive to be there for others. Yagi had seen it firsthand, and he knew that with a little push in the right direction, he would surely find it with ease. One of his hands found its way to the wound on his left side. His time was growing short, and his mission was urgent. He truly felt bad being so hung up on his decision, and he knew that making that choice was paramount to the security that only barely held the country together. Seedier elements had been stirring lately, and unless he could find a worthy successor to One for All, the world would not be ready to face the danger those elements pose. Yagi had been raised, in an era where villains had much more freedom to act and where heroes had less power and sway. He would be damned if he let the country, or the world sink back into that morass of darkness. More and more he was wondering if it was selfish of him to favor the first-year student. Was it wrong to have such a high regard for the kind young man who he'd gotten to know in the year before his tenure at UA had begun? The questions chased each other around his head and he was no closer to an answer than when he'd arrived. In the end, he just stared out at the sparkling waves that danced over the sand, silently wrestling with the dire choices that needed to be made, and soon. Nana, he said again, with the same reverence as before, who would you have chosen? His question went unanswered in the twilight. Aizawa Shota, pro-hero Eraserhead, was not ill-suited to teaching. He was also not particularly well-suited to teaching either. He occupied a middle space, where he had both the skill and intuition for the job but not the passion or the personality to be exemplary at it. He had chosen to teach for two reasons, the first of which was that the younger generations needed someone to ground them. He was more than capable of keeping his students grounded and he opted to use logic and reason to tether them to the earth. The second reason was that despite his personality he truly cared for the welfare of these children. If no one taught them the ins and outs of heroics in a way that would keep them from career-ending disasters, they would surely implode in their early years as heroes. He sat, reading the summaries from the matches that All Might had supervised earlier in the day. The sun was well below the horizon, and Aizawa was not one to sleep on a regular schedule. He often worked at night during his career, and continued to do so despite the urging of his little furry boss. Many of the battles played out just as logic would dictate for the randomness of the pairings, few minor anomalies in the majority of the mock battles. One major anomaly stood out to him. The first match had resulted in quite the upset, with the mild-mannered and quiet Midoriya and bubbly and cheerful Uraraka coming out victorious over the much more battle-ready pair of Bakugo and Iida. Bakugo's aggressive nature had registered as troublesome from the moment he'd met the kid. He'd been the only candidate from the entrance exam to score no rescue points, even by accident. His villain point score had been very high and was impressive, but he could tell that the young man lacked something essential to hero work. He was sure that Bakugo would gain these traits over time. The curriculum at UA was good at teaching the lessons and instilling those qualities in those that would listen. He was a problem child, but a manageable one. Midoriya, however, was an altogether different story. Where Bakugo seemed to be the unstoppable force, Midoriya represented the immovable object. While his potential was not lacking, Aizawa had pegged him as a second-rate hero candidate at first. Despite the opinions of the other faculty on his performance during the entrance exams, which he would not deny, Aizawa had found only middling respect for the boy. His quirk apprehension scores had been only above average at best, and had barely scraped by his expectations. Having watched the footage of the battle between these two students, he was being forced to re-evaluate the boy. In the actions taken, Aizawa saw the ghosts of many heroes current and past. There was a passion in Midoriya that rivaled that of his opponent, even if it was expressed in less overt ways. Beyond the overall results of the battle itself, he knew that the boys had gone to the same school for many years, and lived in adjacent neighborhoods. Clearly the battle had quickly gone from academic to personal. Bakugo had escalated it to that level, and Midoriya had adapted to it impressively. Both boys had acted rashly and in illogical ways. Aizawa had two problem children, and they had history between them to boot. He scratched the ears of a cat that he'd taken in recently, reveling in the calming effect it had on his ever-tight nerves. He liked cats, but he didn't always have the time to care for them properly. He tended to foster cats until they could be rehomed with more stable families. Sometimes, he felt his teaching was something of a parallel to this hobby. Now he had two kittens that needed fostering, and he knew that it would be a tremendous effort to rehabilitate them. Should have expelled them, he trailed off. The recordings did not have audio, so Aizawa could only guess at what personal conflict had brought about this reckless behavior. All Might had left out any details in his summary, giving him nothing to work with. He would likely need to have a word with the man about his teaching methods. In the meantime, he'd have to watch them both closely to make sure neither boy could do anything to jeopardize their safety or the safety of others. It was his duty to shape the next generation of heroes, and he would not fail. He took another sip of coffee, and set an alarm on his phone for sunup. He would not sleep, but he needed to be sure that he would be ready for classes the next day. Too many problem children want to be heroes. A sigh escaped him, before he went back to his work. So much exhausting work. Come on, Honoshiro. The voice was raspy, and light. If you listened you would clearly hear shades of madness in its airy tone. Don't you want to see the heroes that are always harassing you taken down a peg or two? The man sat upon one of several stools in what appeared to be a classy, well-lit bar where he was the only patron. The atmosphere of the place was at odds with its occupants and it sparked an eerie uneasiness in his chest. Honoshiro Akudo shivered. He did not like this place, nor did he like this man. Send me back. The timbre of his voice was just shy of an alto. He felt his skin crawl, and he had to double-check to make sure he hadn't activated his quirk. If he had done so he might not make it out of this place alive. I already told you I don't want anything to do with your League of Villains. He had been in a defensive stance the entire time. Send me back, Shigaraki. Beneath that hand mask, he saw the mad smile strain just a bit. Not good. Doesn't it make you angry? The dry cracked skin stretched even more as the man continued. Just because your quirk makes you look like a freak, all those simple-minded cretins keep you from living free. Akudo eyed every movement of Shigaraki's hands. He may not have been a villain per se, but he had run with the crowd that knew just who this man was, and what he was capable of. I'm not looking for anything so grand, he replied. I just want to do as I've always done. Drifting around and staying under the radar. Shigaraki's smile turned. There was a moment where Akudo thought perhaps he might die anyway, but the other man made no move to harm him, yet. Seriously, Shigaraki scoffed. I need every player I can get my hands on for this raid. We have reliable DPS already, but the strategy relies on kiting the ads to keep them out of the way. He watched as the other man gingerly picked up a glass of some amber liquor that had been placed in front of him on the bar. Careful not to touch the glass with all 5 of his fingers, he lifted it to his cracked lips and took a swig. All you would have to do is distract the NPCs for us and our tank will do the rest. He placed the glass back down, but he didn't return to looking at him. Akuto shook his head. He ran a hand through his dirty white hair and idly tapped at the pieces of skull he'd grown out of his skin to add a flair to his appearance. All over his body there were pieces of bone jutting out of his skin, running along his arms and fingers like sleeves and gloves. Bone spikes jutted from his shoulders and elbows, poking through his shirt in places. Once in a while he'd even grow an extra set of teeth over his lips, always good for a scare during the fall season. His skin was almost as pale as the bones that protruded from it. Bits of extra kneecap showed through the tears in his jeans. I told you. His tone was polite and a bit stiff. I'm not interested. Just have your bartender send me back to Saga. There was a sigh, and Akuto twitched a little, ready to try defending himself if necessary, but no attack came. Fine. Shigaraki was not happy, but it seemed as though he wasn't going to try and force him to participate in his fool's errand. Kurogiri, the mist-shrouded figure, looked up from where he was cleaning an empty glass behind the bar. Send him away. Akuto's red eyes narrowed at the command, but he dared not move. Of course, Shigaraki Tamura. He lifted an obscured hand and dark mist surrounded Akuto. The tense atmosphere of the bar faded from around him and abruptly he was standing in some dismal alleyway. Without even needing to check, he knew he wasn't back in Saga Prefecture. The air lacked the salt tang of the coastal province. Damn it. First that bartender bastard showed up out of nowhere outside one of his favorite haunts back in his hometown and dragged him off to who knows where. Then after making him sit through that incompetent sales pitch they dump him in some random part of Japan. I'm gonna miss my concert. His hand subconsciously reached into his pocket and crushed at the ticket he'd purchased. To see Death Masumi perform live at the town's rec center. Fucking Shigaraki. He sprouted a long bone blade from his forearm and stabbed at a random trash bin, putting a hole in the side and leaving the calcified blade sticking out of the bin. Honoshiro Akuto was pissed, but he was also just a bit relieved to still be alive. Izuku felt underdressed in his gym uniform while everyone else was sporting their hero costumes. He was still waiting for the support company to repair and return it to him. Still, there was palpable excitement in the confines of the bus as it wound its way across UA's sprawling grounds. The ride would take about 20 minutes, but at the end of it they would be practicing search and rescue missions in the USJ. Normally, Izuku would be seated near his friends Iida and Uraraka. But in the rush to board the bus, despite Iida's protests, he had ended up between Asui Tsuyu and Kaminari Denki. Quit moaning, it's not that bad. Jiro Kyoka was tapping away at her phone as she spoke. The punk rock aesthetic of her outfit making her look like any other disaffected teen. She was responding to Iida's complaining about the bus layout ruining his boarding plan. Izuku was rather relieved that he didn't have to sit next to Bakugo, as he would have if the syllabic name order had been maintained. Still, he continued, you all could have shown a bit more decorum in your boarding. His shoulders were slumped and he hunched over in his seat, the expression on his face clearly frustrated. Just chill. Ashido Mina patted him on one armored shoulder. It's okay Iida. Izuku took the moment to speak up. You're still doing a good job as class representative. Iida sighed and sat up, and while he still seemed annoyed Izuku could tell he felt better by the straightening of his posture. Say, Midoriya. He turned to his left to see the rather stoic face and large eyes of Asui Tsuyu. While she waited for his reply a stray, Kiro, slipped from somewhere in her throat and the tip of her tongue poked out of her mouth. What is it Asui? For some reason Izuku didn't feel quite comfortable under his classmate's gaze. There was something about Asui's eyes that felt like she stared right into a person's core, making it hard to hide secrets. You're supposed to call me Su. Izuku stuttered out an apology as Tsuyu continued. You went to the same school as Bakugo, right? Izuku simply nodded, not sure where this was going. Has he always been so angry and loud? Izuku stared, nonplussed for a moment, and he could feel a pair of angry eyes on him in that moment. He stalled for a few seconds, trying to find a way to avoid a thrashing, verbal or otherwise. Bakugo's always been confident, his nerves were clearly apparent in his voice, and sometimes that's made him a little forceful. He trailed off, not wanting to draw any more ire from his rival than necessary. I think it will be hard for him to become a popular hero with that attitude. Kiro. Asui poked one side of her mouth with one finger and shot a glance at the object of the conversation. If you got something to say, Say it to my face, Toad Lips. Izuku nearly gave himself whiplash turning to see Bakugo nearly standing on his seat. Thankfully his anger wasn't aimed at him directly. He'd had enough of that for a while, and he wasn't keen to experience it again anytime soon. Dude, the response came from Kaminari. We've known you for less than a month now, and we all know your personality is a raging dumpster fire. Izuku felt the fire of Katsuki's gaze pass over him to land on the boy to his left. Don't you think you should tone it down? The flippant remarks merely intensified the annoyance on Bakugo's face. You want to throw down? A fist was raised and one foot found its way onto a railing. I'll take you right here. Right now, Taser Boy. Before a fight could break out, a stern glare from Eraserhead forced Bakugo back into his seat. How did you put up with him? Kaminari's query was directed at Izuku. Izuku fumbled again, not used to having people being so direct with him. I just kept to myself really, he said. He and I were close until 2nd grade, but we kinda drifted apart and made different friends after that, so we didn't really talk much until recently. That sounds like it was difficult, Tsuyu remarked. She dropped her hand back into her lap, and Izuku thought he could feel some sympathy in her stoic gaze. Good thing you have the perfect quirk to defend yourself, huh? Izuku didn't really respond beyond a vaguely affirmative sound, while his hand found the back of his neck. The rest of the ride to the USJ was spent in mostly amiable chit-chat. Izuku and Tsuyu had gotten into a debate on the role of heroes in the social structure of Japan and other countries. They were at odds about certain kinds of social behavior, but they agreed on most other aspects, including the duty of a hero to comfort the individuals as much as the masses. Izuku could see himself debating with the girl in the future and made a note to himself to bring some of his ideas for quirk moves to her for evaluation. She seemed to have a mind for analysis, and he hoped she could help him overcome some of his quirk's shortcomings. Before he could bring that topic up, however, Aizawa called for them to quiet down. We're here, he said as the bus pulled up to the domed structure of the USJ. The excitement of the trip was still buzzing high among his classmates, but as they walked into the main entrance a pit of dread was starting to form in his stomach. Something felt off to Izuku, and he was struggling to figure out what was wrong. It didn't help that All Might hadn't been there when they'd arrived like Aizawa had told them earlier. 13 and Aizawa's clandestine huddle off to the side did nothing to make him feel any less on edge. 13 explained the layout of the USJ to them, and the reasoning for creating such a place. In clockwise order from the entrance, there were areas set up to simulate various disasters. First was the Ruins Zone, a ruined city that simulated urban disasters. Further down was the Landslide Zone that simulated rock and mudslides over various types of terrain. Next was the Mountain Zone, a simulation of the numerous scattered mountain ranges that were ever present in Japan. Coming back up the other side was the Firestorm Zone, a domed area that simulated raging fires in urban and forested areas. An aquatic disaster zone sat in the 9 o'clock position, simulating floods and shipwrecks among other water-based disasters. Finally, there was the Downpour Zone that simulated typhoons and other weather-based disasters. Overall, the place was impressive. It even had a large fountain at the base of the stairs leading down into the facility proper. Izuku was looking down at the fountain when he noticed something that made the pit in his stomach intensify. Swirling black mist was gathering in front of the fountain and all around the base of the stairs. Out of those swirling mists stepped people, none of whom looked friendly. As Izuku and Tsuyu made their way out of the downpour zone of the USJ, they had a moment to take in the chaos surrounding them. Off to their right, the aquatic disaster section had been turned into a huge iceberg. There was no doubting that was where Todoroki had ended up. There were sounds of conflict coming from all over the place, and it set his teeth to grinding not knowing where his friends and classmates were. The scene from earlier flashed through his mind. The villains appearing through those swirling black gates. Bakugo and Kirishima's attempts to subdue the mist-shrouded figure, 13's quirk being turned back on them, and that black mist engulfing his classmates. Whatever was going on, it was clear that the villains didn't know what quirks each student had because Tsuyu would have ended up in the Firestorm Zone. We need to find some of the others and head for the center fountain. Izuku's thoughts were barely organized as he ran through all of the options. I think we can meet up with Todoroki on the way back and we can find a way to assist Aizawa. His breath was slowing down as he looked around, but it was nowhere near even. Are you sure that's wise, Midoriya? Tsuyu had been in boon to their escape from the villains in their section. Her level head and analytical mind had given Izuku the sounding board he needed to find a way out of their predicament. The villains we took out back there didn't seem too strong, but the ones in the center seemed to be the leaders. We're probably outclassed. He squinted in the direction of the entrance, trying to see if he could tell who was left there. She wasn't wrong, and Izuku knew it. She is very much right, Izuku. Kish echoed her from the back of Izuku's mind. In your current state there is no telling how dangerous these people are. I would advise waiting for reinforcements. Having his mentor back up his classmates' sentiments was not reassuring in the slightest, but while he knew they were both right, he couldn't just stand around and do nothing. His fingers itched to do something and he could feel the restlessness in his legs at their inaction. I know we're just students, he said, but we have to do something. That's what it means to be a hero, right? Despite his non-confrontational manner, Izuku had a stubbornness in him that refused to let him stand still when there was something he could do. We'll figure out what we can do on the way over. He pointed towards the center fountain where the now frozen water reached the plaza. For now, let's see if we can catch Todoroki at the edge of the aquatic zone. Without giving either of his companions time to argue with him, he dashed off toward the objective. In the distance, Izuku could hear faint explosions coming from the mountaintops across from them. Bakugo must have ended up there. Izuku knew he'd be able to handle himself, and he hoped anyone with him would be spared the brunt of his ire. He was sure the villains in the area were being turned into literal cannon fodder at his rival's hands. In the center of the USJ, he could faintly make out the motions of a fight. He could only guess that Aizawa was trying to hold off the villains while they waited for backup. Izuku and Tsuyu made it to the edge of the frozen water in time to spot Todoroki sliding across the ice towards the center. Izuku began waving, trying to get his attention, and it wasn't long before Todoroki changed course in their direction. Moments later he hopped onto the walkway, all of them several meters off from the main plaza. We don't have much time, he said. I managed to get one of the villains to talk, and he said they're here to kill All Might. Suddenly, Izuku flashed back to the incident with the press sneaking onto campus. Someone had stolen a class schedule during the confusion and had found out All Might was supposed to be here. This wasn't some random attack, it had been planned. We need to help Mr. Aizawa. He's holding off the main forces in front of the entrance stairs. I don't think there's anything we can do though, Tsuyu said. She eyed both boys and glanced back towards the fountain. Mr. Aizawa is a pro, she said, he can handle himself, Kiro. As soon as she'd said it, there was a loud boom from behind them. They all looked back to the fountain to see a huge black monstrosity had slammed Aizawa to the ground, and Izuku unconsciously took a few steps back at the sight. The figure from before with all the hands attached to his body was saying something, but he was too far away to hear. They all took unconscious steps closer to the fight, but stopped in their tracks when the leader turned towards them and started walking. Now his words were audible, and they balked at what he was saying. Since All Might stood us up on this little date, we'll just have to make a lasting impression before we go. He walked toward them with a hand raised, clutched around a piece of rubble from the plaza that was slowly crumbling under the man's touch. None of them could move as the villain strode toward them. The rubble fell away into dust and the hand began to reach out to the closest of the three, Tsuyu. Izuku activated his quirk, ripping the sleeve of his gym uniform in the process, and jumped in front of her with a shield raised in front of him. He felt the light touch of fingers on his plates, and there was the unmistakable sensation of pain where the plates started to decay. He was determined to stay his ground when suddenly the pain stopped. How impressive! The man turned back, and they all saw Aizawa's head pulled up from where it was being forced to the ground, eyes red and gleaming. Even now you're committed to being a hero. Izuku recovered from the surprise first and swiped his shield out, aiming to strike the man's head, but before he could get close there was a movement faster than he could track. Suddenly he was blown back and he felt the rest of the plates in his shield crack. He had expected to feel the hard ground under his back, but instead he felt his descent slowed as something soft wrapped around his waist. Moments later he felt pain explode in his arm, and he realized he couldn't move it. Opening his eyes he saw Tsuyu's tongue wrapped around him and he could feel himself being lowered. To one side, he saw that Todoroki had sent up a wall of ice where they had once been that was now shattered. The black monstrosity was standing there behind it, fist forward. Just as his feet hit the ground he felt rather than heard an explosion. Everyone's gaze was drawn to the entrance doors where the dust was settling and a lone figure stood in the doorway. Even at the distance that was between them, Izuku could just make out the imposing figure surrounded by the glow of daylight from outside the dome. The broad shoulders and tall stature was unmistakable. All Might had arrived. Izuku could see the manic grin on the leader's face even under that mask he wore. The main event has begun. Before anyone had a chance to move, All Might leapt into action. In the blink of an eye, Aizawa was swept from where he lay and moved to the side where Izuku could now see Uraraka, Shiro, and Sato huddled near the base of the stairway, likely having been sent to the ruins zone. With a nod and a word to the three students, he dashed back into the fray. Izuku had a hard time tracking him as he took out villains across the whole plaza. Then he saw the black monster engage with the symbol of peace, and it seemed like All Might's attacks had no real effect on the thing. "How do you like my Nomu?" Izuku could just barely hear the voice of the leader say. "He's been specially engineered to counter you, and will be the key to your demise." The two powerhouse figures exchanged a few more blows, with a similar outcome. "Just punching him won't do you any good. He's got shock absorption, so you'd be better off cutting away his flesh, if he'd even let you." There was a wheezing laugh of satisfaction. The black mist figure had made its way back to the leader's side during the scuffle. "It is not wise to let such information be known to the enemy, Shigaraki Tamura." The figure spoke, and his low voice sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. How could anyone be so calm in all of the chaos surrounding them? "It's fine, Kurogiri," Shigaraki responded. "We're going to clear this stage and return to base triumphant." All Might and the Nomu continued to trade blows, and Shigaraki seemed to have his attention fixed on the battle of the titans before him. Izuku motioned for his classmates to huddle close. "We need to find a way to intervene." Izuku didn't take his eyes off of the action as he spoke, but he could tell that his companions were hesitant. "Keep your eyes open for an opportunity. I think our best bet is going to be to try and freeze the big guy so All Might can get the upper hand." "They're moving too fast," Todoroki said. "If I tried now, there's a good chance that I could end up hindering All Might." Izuku caught himself before he could let out a curse. They watched the fight, and All Might said something before grabbing onto the Nomu from behind. There was a loud bang, and a tower of dust obscured their vision. When it cleared, they saw All Might in an awkward situation, the Nomu half sticking out of the ground and clutching at his midsection from inside a portal. To Izuku's horror, All Might's white shirt had been stained with blood. Shigaraki wasted no time gloating, but Izuku wasn't paying attention to what he was saying, because as he and Kurogiri were bantering, he saw something that gave him hope. Across the plaza, coming from the mountain zone, were Bakugo and Kirishima. Todoroki. Izuku saw him turn at the edge of his vision. "When Bakugo and Kirishima make their move, I want you to ice the monster." He saw the questioning look on his classmate's face out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't turn to him and focused on tracking the movements of his rival. Just as he suspected, Bakugo lunged at Kurogiri from the back and grabbed onto the armor that surrounded its head. He and Kirishima slammed him into the pavement, and Izuku motioned to Todoroki. Ice shot across the floor and into the portal, freezing the Nomu's entire right side. With its grip loosened, All Might freed himself and backed off. Bakugo and Kirishima tried to keep Kurogiri held down, but they were in a standoff with Shigaraki. Before anyone could capitalize on the situation, the Nomu pulled itself out of the portal, which caused its arm and leg to shatter into pieces. To everyone's shock, the monster simply regenerated its lost limbs and stalked back over toward Shigaraki. All Might moved to intervene, and engaged the Nomu once more, but not before Bakugo and Kirishima were forced to back off of Kurogiri. Izuku was shifting back and forth between All Might and the Nomu, to his friends standing off with the two ringleaders. He was trying to come up with some sort of plan other than just standing around. Before he could think of anything, he heard a shout of "Plus Ultra," and the Nomu was catapulted through the USJ's dome at breakneck speed. All Might stood triumphant across from the pair of villains and dared them to attack. At first he didn't think they'd do anything, but Shigaraki took a few steps toward All Might. Izuku's mind latched onto this action, and after a moment, he noticed that All Might wasn't moving. Just standing there while Shigaraki advanced didn't make any sense. Something was wrong, and All Might was in danger, even though Izuku had never dreamed that phrase would ever cross his mind. He heard his friends cry out, and it wasn't until a few moments later that he realized it was because he was running. His left arm dangling uselessly at his side, he raised another shield with his right and was prepared to attack Shigaraki, who turned and held out a hand. Izuku couldn't stop, however, because he'd already leapt with all his might and was falling into that upraised hand. Then a shot rang out, and a bloody hole appeared in that hand. Shigaraki flinched back and jumped away, back toward Kurogiri, who was already opening a gate leaving Izuku to hit the ground. It sent a shock of pain up his broken arm and he barely heard Shigaraki speak. "We'll have to retreat," he said in a disappointed tone. "Time to regroup," and he was cut off by several more bullets lodging themselves into his shoulders and shins. Before he could properly hit the ground, he was swept away by black mist. The other teachers had arrived and were rounding up the remaining villains, and Izuku lay on the floor cradling his broken arm. He chanced to look up at where All Might stood and he looked strange. He had turned slightly away, but somehow Izuku thought he looked lopsided. It was like one side of him had deflated. He was trying to figure out what was going on and make sense of the chaos of the last few moments, but he was interrupted by Miss Midnight kneeling in front of him. "Better get some rest till we can get that looked at." He smelled something sweet and felt his eyelids grow heavy. His sleep was peaceful. When Izuku had awoken in the infirmary, he was told that his arm had been fractured in several places with more severe fragmenting happening in a few more, and that he'd been lucky to not be injured even worse. Recovery Girl had admonished him for reckless behavior and had insisted that he be kept overnight for observation, as the seriousness of the injury meant that she wouldn't be able to do a full healing right away. He'd groaned internally at the time, and had called his mother to make sure she knew what was going on and that he was fine. He knew she'd have a heart attack if she learned about everything on the news. The next day he had several visitors. Tsuyu and Todoroki had stopped by to check on him, and Iida and Uraraka had come after classes with his homework and had stuck around to chat with him. He got a real surprise during the latter visit when there was a commotion at the door. He looked up to see Naomi and Taro rushing over to him, brushing past his other friends in the process. Izuku. The chorus of his old school friends startled him into dropping the pencil he'd been using to scribble notes. They were still in their school uniforms, which were primarily white with orange trimming and a rather garish orange and blue tartan. "Suzuhara? Nishimura?" His eyes went wide and his mind had gone blank for a moment. "What are you guys doing here?" "Dude." Taro nearly yelled at him. "First we see all over the news that your school was attacked by villains." He brushed his brown hair out of his face as he spoke, worry clear on his face. "Then we find out from your mom that you got hurt too." There was a worry in his old friend's eyes that he'd never seen there before. It had been a few months since he'd seen Taro last, but he'd never seen that frightened look on his face in the entire time he'd known him, save for possibly the time he'd almost been hit by Bakugo's quirk. Naomi had grabbed his good hand and was holding onto it like he'd disappear if she let go. "I was so worried when I found out, and we came as soon as classes let out." She looked for all the world like she was holding back tears, and Izuku's heart clenched a little at the thought of causing his friends such distress. He'd never even thought to let them know he was okay. "They were giving us a hard time at the gate, but some old dude vouched for us." Taro had grown much taller in the time since their last meeting, and he was almost as tall as Iida now. "Who are these guys, Deku?" Uraraka barely had the words out of her mouth when Naomi's head snapped in her direction, making her ponytail whip around, an expression of anger and disgust on her face. "Don't call him that." Uraraka flinched at the harsh reply and Izuku had to jump in to clarify. It took a few moments to calm her down and she argued with him more than once before he could get her to listen to him. "It's okay, Suzuhara," he told her, "it's not like that." He quickly explained how the name had taken on a new meaning for him and Uraraka had helped him make that leap. "Guys," he said, "these are my new friends, Iida Tenya and Uraraka Ochako." He motioned to each in turn and then continued, "These are my old school friends Suzuhara Naomi, and Nishimura Taro." Once again he motioned to each in turn, and polite greetings were given all around. Iida placed a hand on Ochako's shoulder and spoke. "We'll check on you again tomorrow, Midoriya." He pushed his glasses up with one finger and turned to leave. "I assume you'll be able to attend classes by then." His tone was one of mixed hope and apprehension, and Izuku nodded in what he hoped was a reassuring manner. "Sure," Izuku replied. "Recovery Girl says she'll be able to do the full restoration by tomorrow morning and I'll be all clear." With a polite goodbye the two left, and Izuku thought he saw a strange look on Uraraka's face as she left, but he was quickly distracted by his remaining friends. Naomi and Taro spent a half an hour chatting with him and catching up. It was good to see them again, and he made sure they knew he'd be fine the next morning. They left with promises to hang out on an upcoming weekend. By the end of the day Izuku felt exhausted, and barely managed to finish his schoolwork for the day before sleep claimed him. In the morning, just as promised, Recovery Girl finished the healing and Izuku was fit to return to classes. He was a bit woozy at first, but his excitement at being allowed out of bed again quickly overcame his tiredness. He found himself sitting at his desk almost 20 minutes before classes began, reviewing all his notes from the last 2 days. He was sure he hadn't missed much, and his friends had gotten him his work from those days already. His homework was already on Mr. Aizawa's desk and he was simply going over the things that he'd not been in class to hear personally. He was deep in thought over English verb conjugations when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Looking up he found Uraraka standing nearby, and she had a strange look on her face. "Oh," he said, "Uraraka, didn't see you there. Everything okay?" Her eyes shifted back and forth for a moment, looking anywhere but at him. Izuku raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything about it. She fumbled for her words for a moment and he waited politely for what she had to say. "Are you sure it's okay for me to call you Deku?" Izuku tilted his head for a moment, before the events of the previous afternoon came back to him. "Of course it is Uraraka." He waved her concern away with his now healed arm, but her brow only furrowed deeper and it bothered him a little that she seemed so worried about this. "But that girl yesterday." Uraraka trailed off and he just smiled at her. "Suzuhara didn't know that I started thinking of it differently. I never got around to telling her about it." He chuckled a little thinking back on it. "Besides," he continued, "it was you who changed the meaning of that name for me, so there's no reason you can't call me Deku if you want." He was putting everything he had into reassuring her, wanting nothing more than to wipe that downtrodden look from her face. A weight seemed to lift off of her shoulders at his statement. Her posture became more relaxed and the expression on her face lightened considerably. The strange look was replaced with one of curiosity. "So," she said, "Suzuhara, right?" He almost missed the question in the wave of relief at seeing her back to her normal self. "Yeah," he confirmed, "Suzuhara Naomi." Izuku leaned back in his chair, figuring he'd have time later to go over his work. "Something you want to ask?" He was curious about what she'd want to know about his old friend and as he sat there he folded his arms across his chest. She hesitated for a moment, and another strange look crossed her face different from the last one. Izuku wasn't sure what to make of either expression, but he was sure that it would all be fine once she'd asked her questions. He had nothing to hide from his friends, barring the origin of his abilities. "Is she?" She trailed off and he could see that she was fighting with herself, though he had no idea why she would need to. "Is she your girlfriend?" The words were so soft that he almost didn't hear them. When the full meaning of the question hit him, he felt his face heat up intensely. In the moments it took for him to compose himself he nearly fell out of his chair. "What? No." Izuku waved his arms frantically in front of him, trying desperately to ward off any misunderstandings. "She's a good friend I've had since primary school, but she's never seen me that way." He had to stop and take several deep breaths to calm himself down. As he once again tried to compose himself Uraraka nearly blindsided him with another question. "She didn't," she started, "but does that mean you did?" Izuku nearly lost it again, and it was only through sheer force of will that he remained calm enough to answer. Just where in the world were all of these questions coming from? Did he give off the impression that he still had feelings for Naomi? "Last year," he said, "I had a crush on Suzuhara." He ran a hand through his hair and took a moment before continuing. "She never saw me as anything more than a friend, and I had no idea how to go about telling her about my feelings." He leaned against the back of his chair and crossed his arms again. "I got some really good advice from someone I had met back then, and I took it. I confessed to her, and she let me down without being cruel. It hurt, but it was better having cleared the air between us." He looked up at Uraraka, who was listening intently. "We didn't let some silly crush ruin our friendship, and that's all we are now." Izuku put on a serious face so that his meaning would get through clearly. "Just friends." "Oh," she said. "I see." The tension seemed to abate as she put her arms behind her back, and her eyes were still shifting around a lot. "Okay," Izuku replied. "Was there any reason you wanted to know?" Ochako looked away, and Izuku couldn't see her face when she spoke this time. "You guys just seemed so close yesterday." He watched her, hoping she would turn to face him again. "I guess I was just curious about that." She remained turned away from him and he was wondering why she kept her face hidden. Before he could ask her about it, Other students began filing into the room and taking their seats. She shook her head and shot him a quick smile. "I'll talk to you later, Deku." Then she walked back to her seat and began preparing for class. He wouldn't really get a chance to speak with her again that day. "Midoriya." Mr. Aizawa's voice rang out over the chaos caused by the last bell for the day. "Come here for a moment." Somewhat startled and anxious, he walked up to stand in front of the teacher's desk. They had all been rather surprised when he'd walked into class wrapped like a mummy, but apparently the hospital staff had not been able to convince him to stay for observation more than a day or two. "Relax, Midoriya." Aizawa must have noticed how nervous he was. "You're not in any trouble." He heaved a sigh of relief. He'd been trying to figure out what he could have done wrong, but had not been able to think of anything. "What is it, sir?" Izuku asked. "I have instructions you are to see the principal before you leave today." Izuku balked visibly. "Like I said," his teacher sighed, "you aren't in any trouble that I'm aware of. He said there was something important he needed to talk to you about, and apparently All Might is involved as well." "All Might?" Izuku asked. Principal Nezu wasn't very forthcoming with details. Aizawa was trying to organizing some papers on his desk with his heavily bandaged hands as he spoke, and the bags under his eyes seemed to darken spontaneously. "That man never is. Just go and see what he wants before you leave." Izuku's brow had furrowed and he'd covered his mouth with one hand. He was likely on the verge of a muttering storm when Aizawa spoke again, breaking him out of his thoughts. "You can go now, problem child." Startled, Izuku bowed once before gathering his things and leaving the classroom. His mind was racing over the possible reasons for Principal Nezu to want to talk to him, but for the life of him he couldn't come up with a plausible answer. "Perhaps," Kish interjected, "he simply wants to make sure you are doing all right." Izuku hadn't thought of that. "You did have to spend 2 days in the infirmary recovering from your injuries after the USJ attack after all." "Oh," Izuku thought back. "I hadn't even considered that. That makes a lot more sense." With a possible explanation in mind, Izuku strode more confidently towards the principal's office, going up a flight of stairs and down a few hallways. He knew where the Mouse Man's office was, but he had not had the opportunity to visit yet. He considered himself somewhat lucky that he'd not had a reason to visit before now. Knocking on the office door, he was greeted with a high-pitched, "Come in, Midoriya." Taking that as cue, he opened the door and stepped inside. "You wanted to speak to me, sir?" Inside the principal's office was a large wooden desk that practically dwarfed its owner, and Izuku noticed the room was painted in calming blues and earth tones. There were a pair of armchairs inside as well, one of them occupied by the imposing figure of All Might. His muscled physique made the chair look almost tiny by comparison. Izuku was sure he would have laughed if the circumstances had been different. "Certainly," Nezu said. "Would you like to have a cup of tea?" Midoriya politely declined as the principal motioned to the other chair in the room. "Please have a seat," he continued. "All Might and I have something to discuss with you that is fairly important." Once he was properly seated, Nezu hopped off his chair behind the desk and walked around to stand in front of it. "Before we begin, I'd like you to know that everything that is said in this office will remain confidential, and if you feel like you are becoming overwhelmed, you are welcome to leave at any time." More curious than anything, Izuku replied, "Of course, Nezu, sir." He quirked an eyebrow and looked between the two men in the room. "But what is it that's so important?" At his question, both of the teachers' faces became more serious. "All Might came to teach at UA for more than one reason," Nezu began. "I invited him to come to our school to accomplish a very important mission." As he spoke, Izuku could feel the wheels start to turn in his head. He had heard something about a mission just recently, but was having trouble remembering where. The first step in that mission may be completed if everything goes well in this meeting. Now he was more curious. What kind of mission could All Might be on that involved someone like him? Indeed, All Might spoke for the first time since Izuku had entered the room. "My main priority in assuming the position at UA was to evaluate a number of the students here in preparation for something of extreme importance." Izuku looked over at the number 1 hero and his brow furrowed. "I have an offer for you, young Midoriya." All Might's face was more serious than Izuku had ever seen it, and he was starting to get a little nervous. "If you accept, it will become a major part of your hero education." Izuku hesitated for a moment as the room became quiet. Something was nagging at the back of his mind and it was starting to concern him. "What kind of offer are you talking about, All Might?" Racking his brain for all the possibilities he could imagine, he couldn't fathom what All Might of all people could possibly offer him that would warrant the apparent secrecy of the meeting. Before we can make the offer, Nezu spoke instead, there are some things we will need to reveal to you, and it is of the utmost importance that you promise that they will not leave this room. Izuku looked back at the principal, who wore a grave expression that would have been comical on his mouse-like face if the atmosphere were not so serious. I promise, he said. There was no way that Izuku would ever betray the trust of his idol, and he tried to convey that in his voice and with his face. He must have been convincing enough because when the principal spoke again there was no obvious doubt in his voice. Very well. Nezu turned to All Might. I believe it will be best if you explain. All Might nodded and Izuku turned to fully face the larger man. You may have noticed that I spend very little time outside of classes among the students or faculty here at school. Izuku nodded. It was something that both he and his friends had talked about previously. If Izuku remembered correctly, they had spoken of it recently and he could recall. His train of thought stopped abruptly and immediately switched tracks as All Might continued. There is a reason that I've been making myself scarce since the beginning of the school year. Izuku's eyes fell to the floor and a hand came up to his mouth. Memories flashed through Izuku's mind, starting with the most recent image of All Might's half-deflated figure at the USJ. Other smaller bits of information popped into his head and his eyes began to widen as the pieces fell into place. Then he came back to the conversation he'd accidentally overheard during the trip to the toilet on the day All Might had left in the middle of class. Before All Might could say anything else, Izuku looked back up at him and words tumbled over themselves on their way out of his mouth. Yagi? Was the only thing that came out, but the looks on both of his teachers' faces told him that he'd hit the nail square on the head. Almost immediately All Might's form began to let off what looked like steam, and seconds later there was a puff of white that cleared to show the emaciated form of Yagi sitting where All Might had been. With this form revealed, Izuku felt his eyes begin to roll back in his head and he clutched at the arm of his chair with one hand, tight enough for his knuckles to turn white. He took several deep, steadying breaths to prevent himself from fainting from the shock of it all. He still felt a bit faint as Yagi. No, All Might. And Nezu shared a look. I told you he was intelligent. All Might's praise was near deafening in Izuku's ears. Of that I had no doubt, Nezu replied. More pieces fell into place with this new information. Your injury, he looked up at All Might once more, the one you got on the job years back. It was all he could say, but the nod All Might gave him sent 1,000 questions crashing through his mind. In his stupor he felt his lips start moving and he felt a few names slip from his lips. No, All Might said, a guy like Toxic Chainsaw would never have been strong enough to cause this much damage. The gaunt man lifted his shirt and Izuku could only stare at the web of scars that covered the symbol's left side. The man who gave me this injury destroyed nearly half my respiratory organs. All Might let his shirt drop back into place and continued speaking. All of this is important to keep between us, but what I tell you next will be even more so. The look in All Might's eyes conveyed a near religious importance to his words. The quirk I hold is not a power I was born with. I received it from someone a long time ago. Izuku could only nod, but in his head he was shouting, just like me, I have refused to name my power in interviews because I always thought it was important for people to think it was my natural ability. More importantly, Nezu picked up the conversation, this power has a unique property that sets it apart from almost all other quirks. Izuku silently turned his head to look at the principal. The power that All Might possesses is called One for All, and it is a quirk that can be passed on from one user to another. The revelation of a quirk that could be transferred between people was something that Izuku had never heard of before. In fact, if all of the research that had been done into quirks was to be believed, it was altogether impossible. This is but one aspect of One for All, Nezu continued, because as it is passed from user to user, it stockpiles the strength of each individual for the next to use. How is this possible? Izuku asked the question before he could even realize he'd spoken. How it is possible is not the most important part of this discussion, Nezu deflected. What is important is that the very fact that it is possible to transfer One for All to another person forms the crux of the mission All Might came here to conduct. My time as the symbol of peace is coming to an end. All Might took up the thread of the conversation again. My mission here was to find a worthy and capable successor to this power. Izuku's breathing was becoming shallow and it was taking everything in his power to not think about what all of that meant. I knew there would be plenty of strong candidates here at UA, as there had been when I attended. Indeed, there are quite a few students suitable for carrying on the legacy of this power. Izuku was sure he was about to pass out when he felt a warm sensation on his knee. Principal Nezu had placed a paw on his leg and was making regular motions with his free paw. Breath Midoriya. Izuku followed the motions the principal was making and soon had returned to a more stable condition. There was silence again for a few moments before All Might continued once more. Imagine my surprise then, he said, when before I could even start my tenure here at UA I met a kind and earnest young man who had taken it upon himself to clean up a nearby beach. Tears were welling up in Izuku's eyes now, and his every effort to stop them seemed destined to fail. Getting to know this young man who had caught my attention made me feel as thought there was something special about him. Seeing him work so hard to achieve his goals and the passion with which he did so was humbling to this old man. Tears were flowing freely down Izuku's face now and he was sure he looked a mess. Still, even in his emotional state he felt something building in his chest that he was afraid to acknowledge. Your performance in the entrance exams just proved that you had the potential in you to be a promising candidate. All Might was leaning forward in his chair now and his gaze was almost more than Izuku could take. Then I watched you and young Bakugo trade blows in the mock battle. Here expression became somewhat uncomfortable, and I heard you exchange words as well. The feeling in his chest continued to build and he was afraid of what might happen if he let it free. When I was told of your actions at the USJ, and the things you did after I'd arrived to see for myself I could no longer deny what I had known all along. He paused and his gaze became even more intense than Izuku would have thought possible. I could no longer doubt that you, young Midoriya Izuku, are worthy to inherit my power. With those words the feeling that had been building in Izuku's chest burst like a dam under too much pressure. He hunched over in his chair and let out a nearly silent cry that contained all of the feelings he'd kept bottled up for 11 long years. From that first moment when the doctors had told him he'd never have a quirk and the apology that his mother had given him in place of her support, to the elation of being accepted into UA and everything in between, all of those feelings were finally released from where he'd carefully stored them away during that time. Mercifully, Nezu and All Might simply waited for him to regain his composure. It took him several long minutes to get back in control of himself and stop the tears from falling. Now, Nezu was still standing in front of him. As I said before, you are not under any obligation to accept this offer. The look on his face was still as serious as ever, but know if you decline that you cannot speak a word of what was revealed here to anyone. Izuku gently shook his head. No, he said, it's a lot to take in, but I'd be honored to be All Might's successor. All Might and Nezu shared another look, with smiles on their faces this time. But, Izuku said, there's something I need to tell you as well. A puzzled expression crossed All Might's face, but Nezu's face was unreadable. Does this have something to do with the lateness of your quirk manifestation? Izuku nodded but didn't know what to make of Nezu's accuracy in guessing what he was talking about. Wasn't that determined to be a rare medical anomaly? Or was there really another reason for it? The medical diagnosis was a convenient explanation for it, Izuku said. Something happened the summer I turned 7. I always thought that it was something no one would believe anyway, and it was the only secret I'd ever had a good reason to keep. Nezu stepped back from where he'd been standing and placed a paw under his jawline. He seemed to be thinking, but he motioned for Izuku to continue. Since you have chosen to reveal your secrets to me, it's only fair that I return the favor. Izuku readjusted in his seat and folded his fingers together in front of him so one elbow rested on each arm of the chair. On the night I got my quirk, I had gotten into a fight with Kachan. Young Bakugo? Izuku nodded at All Might's question. He had taken to bullying other kids, myself included. Izuku paused for a moment. I never cared about what he did to me, because in my mind we were still best friends. However, I couldn't stand by when he picked on others, so I jumped in to protect another kid. Both Nezu and All Might were listening intently as he spoke, neither moving to interrupt him, and he was grateful. He thought he might have lost his nerve if they had. I took a beating that night, but it wasn't any worse than what I'd gone through before and I managed to pick myself up sometime after everyone else had left. Izuku took a breath to reinforce his nerves. Before I went home, I decided to see if I could help what I thought was a kitten that was stuck in a nearby tree. What I found in that tree was like nothing I'd ever seen before. He looked up and stared All Might in the eyes, silently willing him to believe what he was about to say. He gave Kish a moment to object or interfere before he continued, but his longtime mentor did not make himself known. There was simply a respectful silence in his mind. The kitten I was trying to rescue turned out to be an extraterrestrial life form, an alien. Izuku paused and fixed his eyes in his lap. There was a long pause, and he kept waiting for one of his teachers to remark on his mental health or ask if he was being serious. After what felt like an eternity had passed, he chanced to look up. All Might's face was locked in a wide-eyed expression, but Nezu was pacing back and forth with an intense frown on his face. Izuku decided to continue before anything could stop him. I had been born quirkless and the doctors had told me that I'd be that way for the rest of my life, but that night I made an agreement with that creature. It had been severely wounded and could at most survive 10 more years without some sort of assistance. With my help he could live for another 10 beyond that. Izuku was tempted to stop and wait for a response but quickly pushed on to keep from losing his resolve. That creature became a part of my body, and in return for my help I was gifted with the abilities that would become my quirk. That alien, who now goes by the name Kish, resides in my body and has been helping me learn to use my abilities since then. Izuku felt a nudge in the back of his head and his mouth began to move without his input. I do apologize for eavesdropping. The deep and rich voice that came out was obviously not Izuku's and it startled even him. I'm afraid it's a rather unavoidable side effect of our shared form. Izuku knew that Kish had only limited control over his body, but he'd never expected that to extend to his vocal cords. Well, this is certainly an interesting development. Nezu's words betrayed no emotion and Izuku couldn't begin to tell what the little mouse man could be thinking. I want to assure you, Kish's voice spilled from his lips once more, I have never meant Izuku any harm, and have only attempted to assist him in all the years we have been joined. My reasons for this arrangement are important, and we may discuss them in due time. Kish was measuring every word that he spoke to convey his honesty. Unfortunately, I do believe that there are more pressing matters for the three of you to discuss and I have 12 more years to prepare Izuku for the purpose of our arrangement. Nezu gave Izuku a somewhat skeptical look. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions, Kish? There's some things that an extraterrestrial would know that might help me confirm that you don't present any danger to Izuku or our school. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Kish and Nezu spoke of some things that almost entirely escaped Izuku, and he could tell that All Might was just as lost if not more so. Words were being thrown around that he'd never heard before, and there were some he knew like, quantum, that he wasn't entirely sure why it would be useful for them to speak of. In the end the tiny principal seemed satisfied and Kish receded back into his corner of Izuku's mind. Well then, Nezu said, this has been a rather enlightening afternoon for all of us. Izuku could only nod in agreement. It would be wise to continue this discussion tomorrow, as it is getting late and I do not want to keep you from your home any longer than you have been, young man. All Might simply slumped in his chair and gave Nezu a look that spoke volumes about his confusion and his exhaustion. We will convene again tomorrow morning in this office, so I ask that you please arrive around 20 minutes early, Midoriya. Yes, sir, Izuku replied. He gathered his things from near the door and gripped the handle. Do make sure to get enough rest. Izuku bowed to his principal and finally left the school grounds at roughly 5:30 in the evening. When he got home, he assured his mother that he was fine and that he'd stayed over at school for another check-in with the school nurse. Dinner was a blur in his memory of the night and he remembered setting an alarm for early the next morning before falling into bed and immediately drifting to sleep. Eat this. Izuku's eyes went a bit wide at the command. He was once again sitting in the principal's office with Nezu and All Might as requested. It would be another 15 minutes before he needed to be in his classroom, and his teachers had assured him that the meeting wouldn't take long. I'm sorry, was all he could bring himself to say. For the transfer of power, All Might was in his muscular hero form as he spoke. You need to swallow some of my DNA. He held a single strand of blonde hair in his meaty fingers. This is probably the least traumatic way for it to happen. The older hero sounded somewhat apologetic as he explained. Izuku's mind immediately found its way to some unpleasant places and he shoved those thoughts away rather violently. Okay, he said. He took the hair gingerly from the hero's fingers and stared at it for a few moments before balling it up and forcing it into his mouth. The feeling was uncomfortable and he resisted the urge to gag several times. When the hair was finally down the hatch, Izuku felt he might have just done the weirdest thing in his life, had it not been for the space alien currently residing in his brain. It should take a few hours for the transfer to happen, but after that Nay for all will be under your control. All Might suddenly deflated into Yagi, something Izuku was still getting accustomed to. We'll have to train you to use it, but at least your body is built well enough to handle the power without coming apart at the seams. Izuku didn't want to say anything, as he still wasn't sure his stomach wouldn't revolt if he opened his mouth. You can head to class now and we'll work out a schedule where we can do our training away from prying eyes. At this, Yagi held up his phone, alluding to them having exchanged contact info when he'd arrived. Izuku nodded and grabbed his backpack, leaving the room with a small wave. Everything that had happened in the past week still seemed so jumbled in his mind. The USJ attack, finding out that Yagi and All Might were the same person and that he would be taking up the power of the #1 hero's quirk. His mind still boggled at the fact a quirk could be passed on like this in the first place. So many things in his life up to this point would be unbelievable if he told anyone about it, and there were times he wasn't sure he wasn't living out some fever dream. The most jarring part of all this had been the dual identity of his idol. Not the passing of power or the revelation of All Might's mission, but that the #1 hero was the same unassuming older man he'd met almost a year ago on that garbage-filled beach. He'd gotten to know Yagi as a person long before meeting All Might the hero, and reconciling the two was still the hardest part. Yet, there was a measure of reassurance in him that both the old man and the symbol of peace thought so highly of him. Izuku absently greeted his friends as he sat in his seat, having reached the classroom before he'd known it. He pushed the thoughts of the last few days out of his mind and tried to focus on his classwork. He'd been mostly successful and was starting to feel a bit more normal as the day wore on. It was halfway through the day that things started to feel off. Just before lunch his skin began to feel clammy and he felt his temperature rise. He rolled up his sleeves and unbuttoned his collar to combat the warmth that he felt, but nothing seemed to really work. His breathing seemed to become short on the walk to the cafeteria as well. He waved off Uraraka's concern when she'd asked if he was okay, but he knew something wasn't quite right. "I'm all right, Uraraka," he said. "I must have not gotten enough sleep last night is all." He wasn't sure his smile was all that convincing, but it was the best he could do considering. After getting his food from the lunch line, the walk over to their usual table felt like a slog. His breathing had become shallow and he felt like he was on fire. He stumbled once and nearly dropped his food before steadying himself to continue. He knew his friends were worried, but he did his best to keep his composure. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to manage it and he stumbled again, barely able to grab onto the table to keep himself from falling to the floor. As he clung to the edge of the table, he heard something inside his skull, a blaring noise that blocked out all other sounds, and he brought one hand up to clutch at his head. "Izuku." Kisha's voice came to him faintly, "This power." The noise in his head drowned out Kisha's words and Izuku struggled to bring it into focus. Something strange. Trying to. Multiple presences. The noise got even louder, and Izuku thought for a moment that he'd gone deaf until he heard the voices of his friends shouting at him. The burning sensation got even stronger and he felt himself lose his grip on the table. Everything was loud and dark. He was vaguely aware that he'd squeezed his eyes shut, but there was no way it should be this dark in the middle of the day in a brightly lit room. Suddenly he found himself standing in a black void. He looked around trying to find anything in the darkness, but there was nothing to see. He couldn't even make out his own body. Until a light in the distance appeared and began to swell, becoming brighter as it seemed to close in on him. As it grew, he could feel someone at his side. Unable to turn away from the oncoming light, Izuku knew without seeing him that Kish was next to him watching the spectacle. Unable to speak, he could only watch as the brightness turned everything white. "There is something within this power." Kisha's voice was more audible here in what Izuku assumed was his mind, but still faint. "Your teachers either did not tell us something, or it is something even they do not know about." Izuku was still unable to speak or think in words coherently, so he settled for a vaguely affirmative response. It seemed like an eternity before he could see anything, but finally the light dissipated to reveal a line of indistinct figures standing before him. They all started out as iridescent, but each slowly took on a solid color as he watched. There were 8 figures in all, and the one farthest to the left began to reach for him. The ghostly white humanoid hand, shimmering with power, reached ever closer to him, though the figure itself never seemed to move from its place. Izuku's thoughts were all over the place and he was unable to move in any meaningful way. He tried to step back, but his legs would not obey and panic was rising in him with every moment. The ghostly hand seemed to come within centimeters of his face when suddenly everything stopped. The world went dark once again and everything faded from his consciousness. He was left once again in a dark void, with only his own presence. He felt every muscle in his body go slack, and while he didn't fall he couldn't be sure if he was still standing. When he woke, he was in the infirmary once again gazing up at the fluorescent lights that had become oh so familiar to him. I have really got to stop ending up here, he muttered to no one in particular. My sentiments exactly. Izuku looked over to see Recovery Girl sitting in her usual chair. Not sure what you got yourself into this time, but I'd appreciate it if they stopped carting you in here every other day. Izuku started stammering apologies and started to get up, but the nurse stopped him short. I don't think you want to do that right now. Your quirk activated when you collapsed and your uniform was torn to shreds. Aizawa had to erase your quirk to get you back to normal. She dropped down from her seat and walked over to another chair where the tattered remains of his clothes were heaped in a pile. Izuku then noticed for the first time that he was sporting nothing more than his underwear. A crimson blush painted his entire face and tinted his shoulders as well. Don't get too worked up, Recovery Girl waved her cane at him. Your friends had the good sense to float you in here before Aizawa erased your quirk, so he and I are the only ones who saw the aftermath. A wave of relief washed over him at the news. Though they could have just rolled you in, she said, what with you all curled up in a ball and surrounded by those scales. A thought occurred to him at her remark, but before he could take it any farther the door opened and two figures strolled in. Nezu and All Might entered, and the larger of the two was holding a new uniform in one hand. To his surprise, All Might was not in his muscled hero form. She knows, was all he said when Izuku raised a panicked eyebrow. He watched as Nezu clambered up onto the chair next to his bed, and was somewhat startled at the concerned look on his face. Can you tell us what happened? Izuku took a moment to parse the question and slowly began to recount what had happened. When he made it up to the vision that accompanied his collapse, Nezu looked seriously at All Might. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Yagi shook his head and shifted from one foot to another. I'm aware of the vestiges of the previous wielders, he said. But in all my years of using One for All I've never experienced anything like what young Midoriya has described. Nezu's paw found its way under his jaw again. Did your predecessor ever mention anything like it? All MGHT scratched his head absently as he spoke. She mentioned the vestiges to me once. The look on his face was one of scattered thought, and Izuku wondered what kind of person All Might's predecessor had been. She never went into detail, and if she'd ever had any visions like this I never heard about them. Izuku sat mulling over the events of the day so far. With a glance at the clock mounted on the wall near the door, he noticed that not much time had passed since lunch. He'd probably only missed a half a class at this point. He felt fine now that he'd woken from his episode and couldn't feel any of the symptoms that he'd experienced earlier. Whatever happened seems to be over now, he said. Nezu and All Might nodded, and the smaller of the two hopped back down from the seat. We'll discuss this later. Nezu seemed to still be deep in thought. For now, you should get dressed and return to class. All Might will speak to you later about training One for All under his supervision. Izuku nodded and absently reached for his backpack, which had been left at his bedside. He pulled out his quirk development notes and jotted down his earlier idea while the adults moved towards the door. Recovery Girl pulled the curtain around his bed so he could get dressed, and he promptly obliged. After returning to class, he was greeted with concerned looks from several classmates, and his friends moved to speak with him during the break between lessons. What happened, Deku? There was clear worry on Uraraka's face, and he could tell Iida was more tense than usual. Oh, he rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. Like I said, I didn't get as much sleep as I should have last night, and it caught up with me before I realized it. Are you sure? Iida raised an eyebrow above his glasses. It looked a bit more serious than that from what we observed. Izuku gave them both what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Of course, he said with a wave. I got worked up over something and it all hit me at once. He looked between them and prayed for them to take the explanation at face value. After another moment or two his friends began to visibly relax, and he too felt the tension seep out of his body. I'll have to be more careful from now on, I guess. Please do. Iida nodded. Your well-being is highly important at this crucial stage of our development. He hesitated a second and a rather queasy expression passed across his angled features. I also don't like seeing a friend in such a state. Izuku's words stalled in his throat at the sentiment behind the statement. The look on Uraraka's face mirrored Iida's mix of concern and relief, and there was a moment where Izuku felt something touch his soul. Before any more could be said, Ectoplasm entered the room and asked everyone to return to their seats so that class could begin. Izuku watched his friends return to their desks and absently touched his chest with one hand. Only a select few people had ever looked at him with those kinds of genuine expressions before. His family were among them, as were his old friends. A rather prideful feeling radiated from the back of his mind, and that too was a mystery to him, if only because he couldn't fathom what Kish was thinking at the moment. He opened his notes and brought his focus to what ectoplasm was saying and began jotting down the formulas that were displayed on the board. He would have time to ponder on all of this later. Days later, Izuku found himself standing in a secluded area on UA's campus. Surrounded by a thick outcrop of trees and more than enough brush to conceal their presence, he and All Might stood opposite each other. Izuku had taken his old t-shirt off and was standing bare-chested in the wet morning air. Dew-drops fell from the leaves around him, and there were the quiet noises of wildlife in the distance. His eyes were closed and he was breathing carefully and steadily. "Good young Midoriya," All Might said, "now reach out and find one for all in your core." Izuku did as he was asked, and it took him several moments to locate the power deep in his consciousness. He took a deeper breath to steady himself and gave his teacher a slight nod. "Now take hold of it and channel it into your body." He hesitated for a moment, but then touched the bubble of energy inside of him with what he hoped would be a light touch. Immediately, Izuku felt a rushing sensation that spread from his core down to his arm, and with a grunt of pain he felt one of the plates on that arm extend twice as fast he'd ever felt. The pain intensified for a split second and he heard a sharp crack echo across the space they occupied. He dropped the power from his internal grasp and his stomach heaved in a way that nearly cost him his breakfast. His eyes shot open and he dropped to his knees, holding his right arm to his chest. Looking down, he noticed one of his plates had gone missing, and in its place was an angry purple welt. "I certainly didn't expect that to happen." All Might was once again in his lesser form to conserve his energy as they went through the beginning stages of his training. "I could use one for all with no problems almost the moment I received it." He strode over to the edge of the small clearing they had taken as their training ground and scratched at his shoulder. Inspecting a tree, Izuku followed his gaze to see his plate embedded 2 inches into the thick trunk of the stately cedar. "You said it was a stockpiling quirk, right?" All Might nodded, finally looking away from the tree. "You were my age when you got it too." Izuku did some calculations in his head and felt a migraine forming at the results. "That's around 25 years worth of power, if I'm not mistaken." 28, All Might corrected him. "I was 14 when I received it and I just turned 42 last year." Izuku was definitely going to have a migraine. He'd have to get some pain medicine from Recovery Girl before classes began. "If I may speculate," Izuku's lips moved of their own accord and Kish's deeper, more measured voice sounded from them. "It may be that the power you build up is more substantial than you surmise, All Might." The older man's eye twitched for a moment before he made to reply. Having Kish's voice come out of a teenager's mouth must have been just as strange for others as it was for Izuku. "That's not an unreasonable assumption." He helped Izuku back to his feet and went back to stand in his previous position. "And you two can just call me Yagi when we're alone like this. There's no need for all the formality unless I'm keeping up appearances." He waved a hand in front of his face and a small smirk tugged at his lips. "Plus I think we've gotten to know each other well enough, don't you, young Midoriya?" It was definitely going to take some time for Izuku to wrap his head around calling the symbol of peace by his actual name. Slowly the two figures were coming together in his mind, but he still got tongue-tied on occasion when trying to remember that Yagi and All Might were one and the same. Sure, his own voice came back to him and he was almost startled by it. "So how should I go about using your quirk without injuring myself?" Yagi was silent for a few moments and Izuku massaged the welt on his arm while he waited. "I was just going to tell you to visualize the feeling you got when using one for all and try to use that as a metaphor for controlling the power." He tapped his leg with one hand while he spoke, "But I don't think that's going to work." He looked Izuku up and down before continuing. "Tell me," he gestured at his student, "what does it feel like when you use your own abilities?" "Well," Izuku thought for a brief second. "At first it was playing tug of war with myself." He used his hands to mime a back and forth motion across his shoulders, but once I got used to it, it was more like flexing a new muscle. Kind of like how some people can wiggle their ears or make their eyebrows dance. "Ah," Yagi nodded. "When I use one for all it's more like inflating a balloon." He held out his hands close to each other and pulled them apart slowly. "He power fills my body when I need to use it," then he brought his hands back together, "then I let go of it when I'm done so it can flow back out." Izuku pondered that for a moment. "Kish," Izuku reached out to his mentor. I want to try something. Can you feel where one for all is? Certainly, Izuku, came the steady reply from the back of his head. Your idea may have some merit, and I'll try my best to assist. Izuku nodded and reached out for the power again, but this time instead of grabbing at the whole thing like palming a ball, he attempted to funnel a small amount of the power out. The rushing sensation came back, but it wasn't as fast or as strong as before. He still struggled to keep the plates in his arms from shooting off like before, and several of them still extend without his command. The strain quickly became unbearable, and with Kisha's help Izuku shut down the connection to One for All before anything could break. This is going to be difficult. Izuku felt himself panting hard, and now both of his forearms were stinging with soreness. That was a little better, but it's still too much for me to handle, he said out loud. It's something we're going to have to work on, Yagi said. I think we've made some good progress already, but getting you up to speed in the next 3 weeks will be our main goal. Izuku looked up at his teacher with a quizzical glance at the 3 fingers All Might was holding up. 3 weeks? The confusion must have been obvious in his expression because Yagi smiled lightly. The older man spread his arms with his palms up in a grand gesture. The sports festival will begin on Thursday in mid-May, Yagi explained, and while I can't tell you anything about the events, I will say it's important for you to make a good impression on the public during the event. Izuku paused suddenly as he pulled his plain t-shirt over his head. How could he have forgotten about the sports festival? UA's sports festival was something approaching a national holiday in Japan. He'd watched the last few years religiously himself. He quickly finished pulling his shirt on and grabbed his bag. It completely slipped my mind. He would have to hit the changing rooms before he could go to class. They're planning on announcing it next week. The older man fell into step with Izuku as they walked back toward the main building. With what happened during the USJ trip, security will be pretty beefed up compared to years past. Izuku nodded, sure that the precautions would be seen as necessary by those outside the school. His mother had been beside herself with worry when he'd told her about the attack. The first years aren't usually under so much pressure, but with all the media attention on your class there's bound to be more eyes on the lot of you this year. Izuku blanched. He knew that becoming a hero would entail having to deal with the media, but he'd never put much thought into how that would affect him. He wasn't entirely comfortable being the center of attention for more than a few reasons, but now that was considering it, All Might was constantly in the spotlight as the #1 hero and the symbol of peace. Yagi must have noticed the uneasy look on his face because the older man put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Don't fret too much, young Midoriya, he said. You'll have plenty of time during your studies to learn how to deal with the press and the public. Right now you just need to focus on putting your best foot forward during the festival and showing everyone what you're made of. Right, Izuku nodded and he felt somewhat better about it, but he still needed to see Recovery Girl about some pain medication. Before he could move to leave the clearing, All Might waved to get his attention. Before you go, he said, if you ever have any more problems with One for All and the Vestiges, make sure you let Recovery Girl or myself know about it immediately. Izuku nodded in reply. I'm glad you're doing well now, my boy, but make sure you rely on us if you need to. It's why we're here as teachers. Okay, Izuku said, I will. Then he turned and headed for the infirmary to see about that pain medication before his headache got any worse. Thanks for watching.